Good afternoon. This is the very first virtual international conference on the South China Sea. My name is Diana Dayao, and it's my honor to be this conference's host. South China Sea, or the West Philippine Sea, is one of the world's busiest waterways and is subject to several overlapping territorial disputes. On July 12, 2016, the UN Arbitral Tribunal in The Hague ruled that the Philippines has exclusive sovereign rights over the West Philippine Sea. Today, amid the aggressive water activities in this territory by China still pushing its claims, we hold the first virtual international conference on South China Sea. Just a reminder, guys, this conference is going to be recorded, and if you do not wish to be part of the recording, please disengage from the conference. Thank you. All right, as a Christian nation, we start with a prayer to be led by Reverend Monsignor Jerry Bitoon, Director of the Cathedral Parish of St. Paul, San Pablo City, Laguna. Father.
A reading from the letter of St. Paul to the Galatians. Let us not grow tired of doing good, for in due time we shall reap our harvest if we do not give up. So then, while we have the opportunity, let us do good to all. Almighty, eternal, and ever-loving God, creator of heaven and earth, and the Father of all that exists, in your desire to share your abundant life and blessings to all your sons and daughters, you have revealed to us your only begotten Son, Jesus, who is the way, the truth, and the life, and the Word made flesh. Under your sovereign lordship and in your own mysterious ways, you have provided for each one of us what rightfully belongs to us, so that no one is deprived of human dignity, honor, and enjoyment of life. A nation that is politically, economically, and militarily powerful has started to claim and occupy areas in the South China Sea that truly, historically, and geographically belong to the Filipino people. We believe that to assert and protest what truly belongs to us and has been favored by international arbitral court is not only a call of justice, but a love for our country and assurance of the well-being of our future generations. We trust that this collective action is in accordance with your will. Therefore, grant that we may be steadfast and untiring in asserting what is truly just and right, as the truth will set us free. Bless this first virtual international conference on South China Sea, instilling the right thoughts in our mind, right words in our lips, and right spirit in our hearts to do what will glorify and honor you. The road to victory is hard and long, but we are confident that anything good that has been wisely and sincerely done will not remain in vain. For as long as we believe in your abiding love and presence, victory awaits us in your appointed time. This we ask through Christ, our Lord. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Monsignor Jerry Bitoon. Now let us place our right hands over our hearts for the singing of the Philippine National Anthem.
Mga kababayan, ang pambansang awit ng Pilipinas.
Tayang magiliw, nagsasilananan, alam ng puso, sa litig mo'y buhay. Lupang hinirang, tuyagan ang magiting, sa mandulupin, di ka pasisingil, sa nalagang tulog sa simoy at sa langit ng pagkaw, ay ginagang tulad, awit
officially welcome everybody, our attendees, our speakers, and our audience, because right now we are live on Facebook on the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea page. Also, to introduce our guest speaker, we have the founder and global chairperson of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, also the organizer of this very first virtual international conference. I give you Dr. Celia Lamkin. Dr. Celia is muted, I think.
All right.
There you go.
It keeps, all right, okay. Sorry for that technical difficulty. Good day, everyone. Welcome to the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, first international virtual conference on South China Sea with the theme, South China, West Philippine Sea 4 years after the UN Arbitral Tribunal decision. I would like to welcome the following. Our guest speaker, Honorable Retired Justice Antonio T. Carpio. Our resource speakers from different countries, Captain Carl O. Schuster, a U.S. retired Navy of Hawaii, Dr. Carl Thayer of Australia, Mr. Bill Hayton of London, Dr. Jeffrey O'Daniel of Japan, Dr. Dean Huang Tang of Vietnam, Dr. Hu Chu Ping of Malaysia, Dr. Ari of Francia of Indonesia, Dr. Giao Huang of Vietnam, Attorney Viet Huang of Vietnam, Director Ashish Shah of India, participants, and our world audience. On July 12, 2016, the Philippines scored a major victory when the International Arbitral Tribunal issued its award on the arbitration case between Philippines and China over the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea dispute. In its 500-page award, the tribunal decided in favor of the Philippines and said that China does not have historic rights to the South China Sea and that their 9-line claim has no legal basis. That was 4 years ago. And while Filipinos gleefully celebrated its David triumph to a Goliath that was China, the feeling was short-lived. Over the years, China has continued to disregard the tribunal decision and maintain its claim that the West Philippine Sea is theirs. China has conducted massive land reclamation activities, turning submerged reefs into artificial islands, capable of hosting military equipment and structures. And recently have sealed its claim by unilaterally announcing the establishment of 2 new administrative structures in the South China Sea. Over these years, China's people have continued to aggressively maintain their presence in these territories despite the tribunal declaration that certain sea areas are within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, because those areas are not overlapped by any possible entitlement of China. 4 years, and the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea can playfully but sadly say 4 years. For many of us who continue to lament at how we were robbed of our victory. All those 4 years, we have been wondering, is there still a glimmer of hope for the tribunal decision to be enforced? Today's session will hopefully help us dissect and better understand the tribunal decision and the challenges after the decision. True to its mission of protecting the sovereignty and preserving the territorial rights of the Philippines, the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea, through its efforts in its sponsoring this conference amidst the challenges of the pandemic, current pandemic. And this early, I can only thank our active and selfless volunteers, first and foremost, and everyone who is part of this session for sharing their time and resources to help shed light on all the confusions that kept dimming our hopes on the past 4 years. In ending, I would like to share my quotation on July 12, 2016. The victory of our West Philippine Sea is the victory of every Filipino. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Celia Lamkin. At this point, we will introduce our guest speaker for today. And Dr. Celia, would you do the honors, please?
Yes.
There you go.
Our guest speaker for today is Honorable Justice Antonio T. Carpio. He was born in Davao City, Philippines. Justice Antonio T. Carpio was sworn in as a member of the Supreme Court on October 26, 2001. Justice Carpio obtained his law degree from the University of the Philippines, where he graduated valedictorian and cum laude in 1975. He placed 6th in the 1975 bar examinations. He earned his undergraduate degree in economics from Ateneo de Manila University in 1970. In his student's days, Justice Carpio was chairman of the editorial board of the Philippine Law Journal of the UP College of Law. He was editor-in-chief of the Gidon, the school paper of Ateneo de Manila University. He also served as managing editor of the Philippine Collegian, the school paper of the University of the Philippines. Fresh out of law school, Justice Carpio went into private practice and founded the Carpio, Villarasa, and Cruz Law Firm. He was a professorial lecturer of the UP College of Law from 1983 until 1992, when he was appointed Chief Presidential Legal Counsel with Cabinet Rank, Office of the President of the Philippines. Justice Carpio was a member of the Board of Regents of the University of the Philippines from 1993 to 1998. He was a member of the Technology Transfer Board of the Department of Industry from 1978 to 1979. He served as a special representative of the Department of Trade for textile negotiations from 1980 to 1981. He was elected president of the Integrated Bar of the Philippines, Pasay Makati chapter from 1985 to 1986. For his distinguished and exemplary service to the Republic, Justice Carpio was awarded in 1998 the Presidential Medal of Merit by then President Fidel Ramos. In 1991, Justice Carpio received the then Outstanding Achievement Award in Law from Ateneo de Manila Alumni Association. In 2002, he was also the recipient of the Distinguished Alumnus Award from the Ateneo de Davao Alumni Association. In 2009, he was conferred as Doctorate of Laws honoris causa by the Ateneo de Davao University. In 2015, he was named an Outstanding Alumnus in Public International Law by UP Alumni Association, and in August 18, 2017, he was awarded by the UPAA the Most Distinguished Alumni. In 2015, the Department of Foreign Affairs sponsored Justice Carpio on a world lecture tour On the West Philippine Sea dispute, Justice Carpio presented the Philippines' perspective on the dispute before think tanks and universities in 30 cities covering 17 countries. In May 2017, Justice Carpio published the book titled The South China Sea Dispute, Philippine Sovereign Rights and Jurisdiction in the West Philippine Sea. Justice Carpio is the chair of the Second Division and chair of the Senate Electoral Tribunal. On October 2016-2019, Justice Carpio retired from the Supreme Court of the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to introduce our guest speaker, the Honorable Justice Antonio T. Carpio.
Good afternoon, everyone from Manila, Philippines. Thank you, Dr. Lamkin, for that introduction. And thank you for inviting me to this seminar. It is my honor to address this webinar. The July 12, 2016 landmark arbitral award in the South China Sea arbitration between the Philippines and China that invalidated China's 9-dash line as a claim to maritime zones is now 4 years old. The award recognized that the Philippines as an exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea, free from any overlapping maritime zones of China, other than the territorial seas of the high tide rocks in the Spratlys and in Scarborough Shoal claimed by China. The award did not rule on the territorial disputes, as the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, governs only maritime disputes. The arbitral tribunal found China's claim to historic rights to the South China Sea stretching back 2,000 years ago to be utterly devoid of factual or legal basis. I call this historical narrative of China the fake history of the millennium. Unfortunately, China has taught this fake historical narrative to its 1.4 billion citizens from grade school to college. As the Chinese government will not correct this fake historical narrative, it becomes the burden of the rest of the world to educate the Chinese people on the true history of the South China Sea. The invalidation of China's 9-dash line effectively means that in the South China Sea, there are high seas, comprising about 25% of the South China Sea, and around these high seas are the exclusive economic zones of the coastal states like the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia. The high seas belong to mankind and cannot be the subject to the sovereignty of any state. All the economic resources in the exclusive economic zones, of course, belong exclusively to the adjacent coastal state. In the high seas and exclusive economic zones, there is freedom of navigation and overflight for all merchant and military vessels and aircraft. These freedoms include the conduct of naval and aerial exercises by military vessels and aircraft in the exclusive economic zones without need for the consent of the coastal states. Since 2002, when the Declaration of Conduct was signed between ASEAN and China, ASEAN states have consistently called for the resolution of the dispute in the South China Sea in accordance with international law, in particular UNCLOS. During the proceedings at The Hague, Vietnam submitted a letter to the arbitral tribunal supporting the position of the Philippines that China's 9-dash line has no legal or factual basis. Vietnam also filed its extended continental shelf claim, ignoring China's 9-dash line, which encroaches on Vietnam's continental shelf. Before the award came out, the European Union and the G7 countries stated that the parties to the arbitration, the Philippines and China, should comply with the ruling of the arbitral tribunal, which was created under UNCLOS. After the award came out, Indonesia renamed its exclusive economic zone in the Natuna Islands facing the South China Sea as the North Natuna Sea, citing as basis the invalidation of China's 9-dash line. Malaysia filed 2 extended continental shelf claims facing the South China Sea before and after the award, rejecting China's historic claim under the 9-dash line, which encroaches on Malaysia's continental shelf. India called for the settlement of the South China Sea dispute in accordance with international law and UNCLOS. Recently, the US stepped up its support for the award by declaring as completely unlawful China's expansive maritime claims beyond what UNCLOS allows. The US promised to support coastal states that it will stand up to China's bullying in enforcing its notorious 9-dash line. Australia also declared its categorical support for the award, demanding compliance from China. There are those who claim that the award remains unenforceable since UNCLOS has no enforcement mechanism to enforce the award. On the contrary, the award is being strongly enforced regularly. Every time that American, British, French, Australian, Japanese, and Canadian military vessels and aircraft conduct naval and aerial exercises in the West Philippine Sea, they rebut China's claim that there is no exclusive economic zone of a coastal state in the West Philippine Sea. These naval powers conduct freedom of navigation and overflight exercises in the West Philippine Sea precisely because there is an exclusive economic zone in the West Philippine Sea. Under international law and UNCLOS, naval powers have the legal right to conduct naval and aerial exercises in the exclusive economic zones anywhere in the world. By definition, the exercise of a legal right is always lawful and peaceful. In the West Philippine Sea, there is only one adjacent coastal state, the Philippines. Thus, the freedom of navigation and overflight operations of the naval powers in the West Philippine Sea is a powerful and robust enforcement of the arbitral ruling, refuting China's claim that the Philippines has no exclusive economic zone in the waters enclosed by China's 9-dash line in the West Philippine Sea. Naval powers outside the region have a legitimate interest in maintaining freedom of navigation and overflight in the South China Sea. First, about 25% of the South China Sea are high seas, which form part of the global commons belonging to no state. All states have the right to fish in the high seas of the world. Second, the US and EU have about $1 trillion each in inbound and outbound trade every year traversing the South China Sea. China does not recognize the right of other naval powers to conduct military exercises in the high seas and exclusive economic zones of the South China Sea without China's consent. However, the Chinese Navy has been conducting naval exercises in the exclusive economic zones of the Mediterranean Sea and the Baltic Sea without the consent of the coastal states. The Chinese Navy has also conducted military operations in the exclusive economic zones of Australia and the exclusive economic zones of Guam, Hawaii, Alaska, without securing the consent of the coastal state. This is a clear double standard. Under international law and UNCLOS, foreign military vessels and aircraft have the right to conduct naval and aerial drills in the exclusive economic zones without securing the consent of the coastal state. Moreover, China is the only nuclear-armed state that has not complied with the ruling of an international tribunal adverse to it and in favor of a non-nuclear armed state. In 1992, the US, a nuclear-armed state, effectively complied with the ruling of the International Court of Justice when it agreed to give Nicaragua, a non-nuclear armed state, economic aid in lieu of the damages that Nicaragua asked for violation by the US of the territorial integrity of Nicaragua. In 2014, India, a nuclear-armed state, complied with an adverse ruling of an UNCLOS tribunal that awarded to Bangladesh, a non-nuclear armed state, 4/5 of the waters in dispute in the Bay of Bengal. In 2015, UK, a nuclear-armed state, complied with the ruling of an UNCLOS tribunal requiring the UK to consult with Mauritius, a non-nuclear armed state, in setting up a marine protected area in the Chagos archipelago. In 2019, Russia, a nuclear-armed state, complied with the ruling of an UNCLOS tribunal when it negotiated and settled the damages awarded to the Netherlands, a non-nuclear armed state, in the Arctic Sunrise case. China today sticks out like a sore thumb as the only nuclear armed state that still refuses to comply with the ruling of an UNCLOS tribunal in favor of a non-nuclear armed state, the Philippines. The survival of UNCLOS, the constitution for the oceans and seas of our planet, depends on the enforcement of the arbitral award in the South China Sea arbitration. UNCLOS, with its own compulsory dispute settlement mechanism, is the most advanced legal system developed by man to govern relations among sovereign states. UNCLOS has also the widest reach since it governs the world's oceans and seas, which cover about 70% of the surface of planet Earth. But if China can claim as its own waters almost the entire South China Sea, swallowing up the high seas, which are part of the global commons, as well as the exclusive economic zones of coastal states bordering the South China Sea, then UNCLOS will certainly collapse. Other nuclear armed states will seize their near seas. China will seize the Arctic. Militarily stronger states will seize the exclusive economic zones of their militarily weaker neighbors. This will spell the end of UNCLOS. Tiny states, like Pacific Island states, have vast exclusive economic zones. If UNCLOS collapses, the vast exclusive economic zones of these tiny states will be open to China's fishing fleet, which is the largest in the world. It is the paramount national interest of the Pacific Island states that UNCLOS survives. Pacific Island states, as well as all coastal states of the world that have militarily stronger neighboring states, have a huge stake in the enforcement of the arbitral award. They must not fall prey to China's checkbook diplomacy and take the side of China in the South China Sea dispute. If China does not comply with the arbitral award, the over 500 million people of the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Brunei will never view China's rise as peaceful. The peoples of these ASEAN coastal states can clearly visualize a greedy China gobbling up huge areas of their country's exclusive economic zones that UNCLOS has conferred on their countries as inherent right of all coastal states. The arbitral award has cemented for all time this inherent right of coastal states. This is the enduring value of the arbitral award. Because of this arbitral award, all the peoples of these ASEAN coastal states know they have an inherent right to their own exclusive economic zones under international law and UNCLOS, and they will never allow their governments to cede their exclusive economic zones to China. I end my remarks here. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Honorable Justice Carpio. That was Honorable Justice Carpio reiterating how apparent and deliberate China is taking over the South China Sea and its complete disregard for the UNCLOS ruling. Later on, we will have an opportunity to ask the Honorable Justice some questions, as the Honorable Justice has graciously agreed to stay with us for the open forum happening in a while. Today, we are going to also have resource speakers, a total of 7 resource speakers from different countries to discuss pertinent topics involving South China Sea. Right now, we are live on Facebook page of the National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea. All right, let us start with our first speaker. We always ask, what is the Sino-American balance of power in the South China Sea? To talk about this, we have our speaker for today to be introduced by Engineer Reniel Rocaberte, National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea, Palawan Chapter Chair. Engineer?
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today's speaker is known for his significant works. He is a retired U.S. Navy who was commissioned as an ensign in the United States Navy at Navy Reserve Officer Training Corps Battalion at the University of South Carolina on 10th day of May 1974. In the 25 years career that followed, he served in a variety of United States and Allied posting on ships, submarines, and headquarters. He retired in 1999 following his tour as a Director of Operation at the U.S. Pacific Command Joint Intelligence Center near Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. In addition to lecturing at the Hawaii Pacific University, he has worked as a freelance writer and a defense consultant since retiring from the Navy. And now, he and his wife, Onkana, live in Honolulu, Hawaii. Please join me in welcoming Captain Carl Schuster.
Captain Carl.
Can you hear me now?
Here you go. Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Outstanding. Well, what I'm going to talk about was introduced is the balance of power. One of the most significant developments that we've seen in the South China Sea over the last 15 years has been the shifting balance of power, where once the various claimants enjoyed near equality in immediate military presence and power there, today China enjoys a growing military presence and power advantage. The United States was able to play a stabilizing role in the past by having no territorial claims of its own and possessing a nearly dominant air and sea power in the Western Pacific during occasions when it chose to demonstrate it. That may no longer be the case. The 2015 Asia pivot that stated the U.S. Pacific Fleet and Air Force were now larger than the Atlantic was actually achieved by decommissioning units in the Atlantic region. The result was the Pacific Fleet became larger, but was not reinforced in any way, nor were the forces in the Pacific region reinforced in any way. Meanwhile, China's air, missile, and naval forces have continued to grow at a record pace. In fact, China's naval construction exceeds that of all other countries in the world combined. There was no reinforcement of America's diminished Asia-Pacific forces before 2018. As a result, the situation has evolved to a point that complicates any calculations about the South China Sea's balance of power. It must now be measured in terms of what is immediately present and what forces may follow up. In that context, China enjoys the advantage of proximity, while the U.S. enjoys the advantage of better logistics and power projection, as well as more allies and partners. The most critical components of that balance are the nations, the respective nations, air, missile, and naval forces, since the South China Sea is primarily a maritime theater of operations. Both countries have placed responsibility for operations in the South China Sea to joint theater commands. That is, commands that are in charge of air, sea, ground, and marine component forces, as well as special forces, assigned to fulfill their geographic responsibilities. For China, that is the Southern Theater Command, led by Admiral Wan Yubai. His American counterpart, Admiral Philip S. Davidson, commands the Indo-Pacific Command based in Hawaii. That headquarters includes liaison officers and teams from 4 of America's allies and partners in the region: Australia, Canada, Japan, and South Korea. Both the Chinese and American commanders have extensive command experience, having commanded fleets assigned to joint theater commands in the past. Admiral Davidson, however, has a broader overseas experience and international experience, having commanded carrier battle strike groups in the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans, and America's 6th Fleet in the Mediterranean. He has also more experience working with and commanding multinational joint forces, primarily, but not exclusively, within the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The two commanders' respective and air and naval components constitute the most visible actors in their respective South China Sea operations. On a daily basis, that means America's forward deployed 7th Fleet, which also can operate as a joint task force, is the U.S. command that operates within Admiral Wan's maritime area of responsibility. Like Admiral Davidson, 7th Fleet's commander, Vice Admiral Bill Metz, has extensive experience working with America's allies, partners, and multinational organizations. His forces are outnumbered by their PLA Navy counterparts, particularly in terms of anti-ship cruise missile platforms, but he commands 1 to 2 carrier strike groups at any given time and a substantial force of submarines. I sent a table that shows that numerical comparison in approximate terms for you all to review. As Indo-Pacific Command's executive agent for maritime operations in the Western Pacific and Eastern Indian Ocean, Vice Admiral Metz is responsible for forces operating on over 34% of the world's surface. The South China Sea is the most important. It occupies an ocean area that exceeds Europe's Mediterranean in size and value of maritime trade. Depending on who you read and believe, between 30 and 40% of global trade in terms of monetary value passes through the South China Sea. Given those latter factors and its role they play in shaping the South China Sea's regional and global importance, Vice Admiral Metz and Admiral Davidson's greater international experience and America's partnerships in the region should be included in any balance of power calculations. He is more familiar, both Davidson and Metz are more familiar with the advantages and limitations of multinational collaboration and operations. In today's world of complex national level political considerations and their impact on national security decisions that affect military operations, that experience may well determine the effectiveness, if not the likelihood, of a united regional response, one that deters conflict or ensures success should one erupt. Looking beyond the commanders, China has invested heavily in building its military infrastructure in the South China Sea. It literally has destroyed over 2.4 million hectares of sensitive and ostensibly protected marine environments that is host to one of the world's most diverse shallow water ecosystems. China has installed radars, anti-aircraft artillery position, barracks, and other government facilities on those islands, essentially to make them unsinkable aircraft carriers. The most highly developed are on Fury Cross, Subi, and Mischief Reefs in the Spratly Islands group, and Woody Island in the Paracels. 3 of those 4 military installations stand on islets or islands seized from other claimants, either covertly or overtly by military force. If power within the South China Sea is the measure, China has the ability to stage about 6 fighters and a handful of reconnaissance and surveillance aircraft, as well as anti-ship cruise missiles on Fury Cross and Mischief Reefs and their airfields in the Spratly Islands. It has also constructed an extensive radar, signals intelligence, command, control, communications, and computer facilities on those islands. And radar stations have also been built on various outlying atolls and islands that China occupies. These facilities give China the ability to closely monitor air and sea surface traffic throughout the region. However, China's aircraft and missile presence in the South China Sea, much like America's naval and aircraft carrying ship operations, is not a permanent presence. There are ground troops on the islands. The radars are operating, but the aircraft make periodic deployments. The extensive surveillance capability does enable China to detect, track, and respond to other nations, including the other claimants, civilian, commercial, and military activities. That, plus the almost continuous presence of Chinese Coast Guard and its paramilitary People's Armed Maritime Militia, gives China a local power advantage over other claimants when no American forces are present. China has the world's largest Coast Guard at 127 ocean-going ships, and its units often act in concert with and support of the 100 People's Armed Militia, maritime militia units in the South China Sea. China stages its air forces to the Spratlys via Woody Island, which lies about 700 nautical miles from Mischief Reef. Woody is the most highly developed of China's South China Sea island garrisons. Its airfield can support up to a squadron of fighters and a small bomber detachment. The H-6K cruise missile carrying bomber deployed there briefly in 2018 and has done so at least once since. Military reconnaissance, surveillance, and fighter aircraft have deployed there and to Fury Cross Ridge earlier this year. China's military buildup has triggered an American response. The introduction of F-35Cs embarked on amphibious ships initially was intended to replace the Marines' AV-8 Harriers, but has since evolved into using those ships as essentially light aircraft carriers. Their F-35Cs and supporting Aegis cruise missile and unmanned aerial vehicle equipped ships exceed the firepower and equal the surveillance capabilities of China's Spratly Island garrisons. Moreover, China's actions have given the Marine Corps time and an impetus to reconsider their operational doctrine and tactics to accommodate potential military countermeasures to any South China Sea scenarios. There is also the issue of follow-on forces. China's Southern Theater Command's air and naval components are quite powerful, larger than that of any of its neighbors. China's Central Military Commission can reinforce the Southern Theater Command by drawing air and naval units from the Eastern, Northern, and Central Theater Commands. The challenge, however, for China is projecting that power out to the South China Sea. Indo-Pacific Command can rapidly reinforce its air power in the region, and naval power can quickly follow. The President may also order additional forces from America's strategic reserve. Moreover, the United States is redeveloping its ability to deploy logistics forces rapidly and also disperse its combat platforms while maintaining the capacity to concentrate their combat power. However, the U.S. faces the challenge of gaining the approval and support of its regional partners. Cruise missile carrying bombers staging out of Guam can reach and defeat a maritime force in the South China Sea, but fighter and shorter range aviation forces must stage to facilities closer to the area of operation. That access is reliant on allied and partner cooperation. That is a political issue that has a significant military and strategic impact. For operations within what China defines as the first island chain, or the waters that lie between China's coast and the first set of islands to the east and south, no partners or other countries' cooperation is required, and China's made that very clear. Beyond air power, any likely opponent is dependent on local staging bases. Nonetheless, China's evolving doctrine appears designed to deny any near-state competitor from intervening in any Chinese aggression against any Western Pacific nation. China intends to control the airspace and waters within the first island chain by 2025 if it does not feel it can do so now. And it will challenge any air and maritime powers operations out to the second island chain by 2030. Its air and naval forces are being structured and equipped to fulfill that goal. For example, the DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missile and China's array of subsonic and supersonic air, surface, and submarine-launched anti-ship cruise missiles pose a very real threat to any surface ships operating within 2,400 nautical miles of China. There is no doubt the DF-26 can take out a stationary target, and today's world of satellite observation of ocean areas makes it very difficult to hide any major warship, particularly in constrained waters like the South China Sea. However, successfully employing an anti-ship ballistic missile against a carrier battle group is itself a challenge. Most Aegis-equipped ships can engage incoming ballistic and cruise missiles. Electronic warfare can complicate targeting and terminal guidance to the defender's benefit. No weapon system or tactic is a panacea. When I was a lieutenant, we feared the then new Soviet near-hypersonic AS-4 air-launched cruise missile. Soviet Union developed a very complex set of tactics to integrate that weapon into a very effective anti-carrier warfare system. However, the United States successfully developed tactics and procedures to defeat it. Fortunately, that test never took place, but ultimately, all weapon systems in combat operations, both offensive and defensive, depend on the training and operational acumen of the people and units that employ them. Neither Navy has recent combat experience in a fleet-on-fleet engagement. So the human element is there. It's a mixture of training, political and personal commitment. The United States is committed to its allies and partners in the South China Sea and freedom to navigate through those waters and airspace. So my hope is, as I think we all do, that we never have to discover if what we're doing is sufficient to win a conflict. We hope we're doing something that will deter further aggression and prevent a conflict. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Captain Carl Schuster. Captain, are you aware that your video is off? Our attendees are wondering of the face behind the voice.
Yeah, unfortunately, my wife's iPad, we got a power surge, and right after I checked in, it blew out. So I had to shift to my personal PC, which is not an Apple, and it doesn't have a camera. And so I'm audio only. However, I'll change that in the next couple of days.
Very well, Captain. Thank
One
you.
point of failure, and it failed.
It's all good. It's all good. Thank you so much once again, Captain. Please stay with us for the.
Yes, ma'am. I will.
All right.
And thank you.
So much. Thank you. All right. Let's move on to our next topic: the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea. Our speaker will be introduced by Mr. Henry Tachado, the National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea, Australia Country Chair. Mr. Henry?
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Carl Thayer. Dr. Carl Thayer is currently the Emeritus Professor at the University of New South Wales and Australian Defence Force. He is also the Director of Thayer Consultancy, a small business registered in Australia that provides political analysis of current regional security issues and other research support to selected clients. He was educated at Brown University with a bachelor's degree in political science, at Yale University with a master's degree at the Southeast Asian Studies, and the Australian National University with a doctorate in international relations. Dr. Carl joined the University of New South Wales faculty in 1979 and taught first at the Royal Military College in Dutton before transferring to ADFA in 1985. He was given leave in the national interest to take up a senior appointment at the Asia Pacific Center for Security Studies in Hawaii. On return to Canberra, he was the academic coordinator for Australia's Senior Defence Course at the Center for Defence and Strategic Studies at the Australian Defence College. He was a CB Star Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the School of Advanced International Studies at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C. He was the inaugural Frances M. and Stephen H. Fuller Distinguished Professor at Ohio University. Dr. Thayer is the author of over 500 publications on Southeast Asia, and since his retirement in 2010, he has delivered 55 papers to international conferences on South China Sea. Ladies and gentlemen, I will present Dr. Carl, our speaker, Dr. Carl Thayer.
Dr. Thayer, we've asked you to unmute. Thank you.
Right. I was thanking Sila for the invitation and the National Youth Movement of the Philippines for inviting me to present. Okay. Today, I want to just talk about 3 points. Why are we talking about a code of conduct in the South China Sea? What is the single draft South China Sea negotiating text that China and ASEAN members are discussing? And what are the key issues that need to be resolved? So why are we talking about the South China Sea? And just a little background, because it starts off in the Philippines. After China occupied Mischief Reef in 1995, the Philippines pushed for a code of conduct. And it's very little known that actually the two sides did submit to each other in March 2000 codes of conduct in the South China Sea. And the reason I put that in is because there are 4 areas of disagreement that prevented that code of conduct from being adopted. What was the geographic scope? China didn't want the Paracel Islands included, Vietnam did. What about restrictions on unoccupied and unoccupied features? So this is just the beginning. What about military activities in waters in the Spratlys? And whether or not fishermen in disputed areas could be arrested. So from the exchange and the failure to have a code of conduct, they moved on to what we now know is the Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea. And that particular declaration is important because that's why we're discussing the South China Sea. This DOC, as it's called, was adopted in November 2000, and it reaffirmed that an adoption of a code of conduct would further promote peace and stability in the region. So that's why we're discussing it. So what has happened since the DOC? Well, what's a very sad point that I want to bring up is that ASEAN and China agreed on the terms of reference of a joint working group to implement the Declaration of Conduct of Parties in the South China Sea, and that's the formal name of the negotiations that's taking place. At the very first meeting of the joint working group, ASEAN submitted guidelines, and it took them 6 years to be adopted, and my next slide will discuss that. And then finally, another 6 years, and they achieved a framework for a code of conduct. So what about the guidelines to implement? The very first draft said that ASEAN, and point 1, will continue its current practice, I think 1 or 2 points, of consulting among themselves before meeting with China. After 21 successive drafts, ASEAN gave that position away. And there were only 2 changes, and the sentence I just read was replaced with the parties to the DOC will promote dialogue and consultations in accordance with the spirit of the DOC. So technically, when we use the word ASEAN, we're really saying 10 ASEAN member states plus China. The framework for a code of conduct was a 1¼ page document with 3 headings and a bunch of bullet points. And I often say it's like getting your young children who are having to write an essay at school, and you say, well, it has to have 3 parts, a beginning, a middle, and an end. So this has a preambular provisions and how the COC relates to the DOC, the general provisions, which are the guts of it, and the final clauses itself. Now, it's interesting that this was adopted in 2011. 2012, the Philippines actually submitted an informal working draft, the Philippines Draft Code of Conduct, but that didn't take off. So now let me move to the single draft South China Sea Code of Conduct negotiating text. That was released by the foreign ministers of ASEAN and the member states in August 2018. It went through it's a living document. It's supposed to go through 3 readings. The 3-year time limit was imposed by the Chinese foreign minister in a sense that he immediately said it would be a 3-year time limit. And for the longest while, ASEAN seemed to accept that, but it dropped it at the last summit meeting because the ASEAN statement said the timeline should be mutually agreed. And because of COVID, there have been no meetings this year, and one was scheduled in Manila, of the joint working group on the DOC that I've mentioned. So we need to have a second reading, and in late 2019, just before Vietnam assumed ASEAN chair, there was a meeting in Vietnam, in Dalat, I believe, and China tried to, in propaganda, say it was a second reading, and Vietnam scotched that. So we have second and third readings, and we've just had, on a previous webinar out of the Philippines, the president of the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, also quoted in CNN Philippines. He's now going to be the ambassador to South Korea, saying, forget about the deadline, the 3-year. That's too far off. So the time frame. Now the general provisions, time won't permit me to go in great detail. I just want to flag that Laos and Myanmar did not bother to submit. So you only have 8 ASEAN countries and China. So you have 9. And it's almost like everybody bought a deck of cards and they just shoved them all together. The single draft is a compilation of various countries' submissions. It's unruly and it needs to be brought together. So that's one thing. It starts off, and it's very important for people who think this is going to be the Holy Grail. It is not, and it takes us right out of UNCLOS itself. It will not settle territorial disputes or maritime delimitation act issues. Those have to be cited quite separately from the Code of Conduct. It's to guide state behavior. So in the duty to cooperate, that's taken out of the UN. And we heard from Captain Schuster what China did to the ecological environment there, but there's a duty to cooperate in a semi-enclosed sea, which is the South China Sea. There are a whole lot of practical maritime cooperation activities that are named, but in that, China says, it comes up with 6 broad areas of marine cooperation, but specifies that should only take place between China and the littoral states, and no countries from outside the region should be involved. And that includes oil and gas exploration, whereas Malaysia's submission said nothing in the COC shall affect the rights or ability of the parties to conduct activities with foreign countries or private entities of their own choosing. Other elements are self-restraint and trust, prevention of incidents. These quote all international convention that you would imagine, so that's a very positive thing if you could tie up all these laws. How to manage incidents, how to prevent incidents, and then how to manage them. In many cases is an overlap with the legal precedents. And then it has other undertakings itself. So that's just showing that. Now, under cooperative activities, every country basically, with the exception of Vietnam, took the 5 areas of cooperation outlined in the 2002 DOC: marine environment protection, marine scientific research, safety and navigation and communication, search and rescue, and combating transnational crime, including but not limited to the following areas. Indonesia added unregulated, unreported fishing, and Cambodia added ASEAN connectivity. I'm not sure particularly what that means. But there are areas of cooperation. In the beginning, it was said you couldn't have a COC until the TOC was fully implemented. And at the moment, only hotlines and queues, a code for unplanned encounters at sea, have been adopted. So what are the key issues in how long they're going to negotiate? And they are heavy and deep. We're back, as we were, to the 2000 original draft COC. Geographic scope is not defined. Some submissions say that the disputed area should be identified. I'm told privately that China has pushed for a COC only in the southern South China Sea to exempt the Paracels and the Scarborough Shoal. So that's important. So the key issues are, what good is it, I say, how absurd it would be to you define a small area and you have to behave inside that. And as soon as you sail outside of that area, you can beat up on another country if you want. So you have that. Next, maritime law enforcement. The COC draft has a lot of activities that are down there, including taking the cues, Code for Unexplained Encounter Sea, which apply to military vessels, and apply them to the Coast Guards. But it also has a statement in there by one of the ASEAN members that we'll need to draft guidelines and protocols. And in my address to the Philippine Navy, I say, watch it, boys and girls, because it's your foreign affairs people that are doing the negotiating, and it's you mariners that are going to carry it out. So we need practical activities there. So we need to draft the guidelines and protocols because that once, if you don't have them and you begin, you're operating without the rules of the game. Military activities, exercises, and delimitation. Here, China says you should give a notice if you're going to operate with a foreign country to see if anybody objects. and that could be a veto on it. One country, Indonesia, puts in give 60 days notice, and Vietnam just says give a notice itself. I add demilitarization, because how can you have a code of conduct with the kind of armament that Captain Schuster just described sitting there? How can you cooperate with that sort of hardware there? Just the littoral states of Southeast Asia. There is no dispute settlement mechanism. There's a proposal that countries could use the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation High Council, and that requires the consent of both parties concerned. And Vietnam has just taken a leaf out of the UN Charter and says, through friendly negotiations, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, and other means as may be agreed. So there's nothing compulsory about that itself. The role of third parties is not mentioned, except that they should be encouraged to support it. And I would argue that has to be firmed up. So maritime states that have a real interest need to become third parties. And finally, the legal status. The wording in the draft says states agree to be bound by it, but Vietnam suggests that it should be ratified by your normal parliamentary processes, by the Congress in the Philippines, National Assembly of Vietnam, National People's Congress in China, deposited with the ASEAN Secretary General, who under, I think, Article 120 of the UN Charter, then would deposit it with the UN. Brunei just suggests a biannual resolution of the General Assembly, which would have no standing whatsoever. So I end my presentation leaving you with these 6 major areas that need to be resolved before we can get a workable code of conduct. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Carlisle Thayer. That was Dr. Carlisle Thayer discussing about the code of conduct in the South China Sea, all the way from Australia. All right, let's move on to our next topic. China's evolving legal positions in the South China Sea. Our speaker to be introduced by Attorney Amy Alado, the National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea Legal Council and the chair of the United Kingdom country.
Good day, everyone. I'm introducing Mr. Bill Hayton, our next speaker. Bill Hayton is an associate fellow with the Asia Pacific Program at Chatham House, a fellow of the Royal Geographical Society, and a full-time journalist with BBC News in London. In 2006-2007, he was a BBC's reporter in Vietnam, and in 2013, he spent a year advising the Myanmar state broadcaster on media reform. He is the author of The Invention of China, published in 2020, and The South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia, published in 2014, and Vietnam, Rising Dragon, published in 2010. He writes about political and regional developments in Southeast Asia and recently received his PhD from the University of Cambridge. Let us all welcome Mr. Bill Hayton.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to join you all around the world. One of the benefits, I guess, if there are any, of the pandemic, that everybody can now talk to each other like this in a much more normal way. I need to apologize. I broke my collarbone 2 days ago, so I've got a sling, and that's made shaving difficult. So you get me slightly rough and ready, I'm afraid. I want to talk for a short time about, actually, if you let me share my screen, then I can control the PowerPoint a bit more easily. Is that okay? Yeah, I'll do it from this end. So I want to talk about China's evolving legal position. I'm going to talk mainly about the questions to do with maritime entitlements. So broadly speaking, there are 2 kinds of legal disputes in the South China Sea. There are disputes about the islands, who owns which one, and there are disputes about the spaces in between the islands as to what you can do, what different countries can do in between. We know that China has, ever since 1948, published this map. This map was first sent to the United Nations in 2009, and that's really when the current intensity of the conflicts really took off. And the big question, of course, is what does this map mean? I would argue very strongly that China only claimed physical features right up until quite recently. This map was published in 1948, and it was intended to show which islands in the South China Sea China claimed. I would go beyond that and say that until 1946, China didn't claim any of the Spratly Islands at all. The historical evidence seems pretty strong in that regard. But in 1946, its claim went as far south as the coasts of, or close to the coasts of Malaysia, the Philippines, and even down towards the Natuna Islands. But this line, this 9-dash line, this U-shaped line is ambiguous, and its meaning has been changing and evolving, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So if you look at where the clashes have been recently, or where the confrontations have been taking place, they are all around underwater features: the Reed Bank, Seahorse Shoal off the Philippines, Vanguard Bank off Vietnam, and Luconia Shoals and James Shoals down close to Malaysia. And these are actually all underwater features which China claimed in error following various translation mistakes made in the 1930s. But you can see where recently in this year and last year, where China has been doing oil and gas seismic surveys and actually been using this 9-dash line, this U-shaped line, as a boundary. I mean, this map, I'm not claiming to be scientifically accurate, but it's approximately right. And you can see that where the oil survey tracks, those yellow lines there, bump up against the U-shaped line, they stop. And so it seems to me pretty clear that in China's actual behavior in the South China Sea, that it continues to regard the U-shaped line as some kind of boundary. But it's not clear what legal basis China is operating under. So if we look, this is what happened last year, and now I've actually been some further instances this year, but there were two main areas of confrontation off Borneo, off Malaysian Borneo near Luconia Shoals, starting in May, and then there was also some drilling by a Japanese company off Vietnam, and that then led to a confrontation there, which was managed in sort of May, July, August, September last year. In the middle of all that, there was a China ASEAN foreign ministers meeting where Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, told ASEAN that these areas were disputed. That was what his word was. But on what legal basis is it possible for these areas to be disputed? I would argue that there can't be a basis for claiming that they're even disputed. So what does China's claim actually entail? Well, China as a state has never precisely explained its claims in the South China Sea. So the best we have are the words of people like Wu Shizun, who is the president of the National Institute of South China Sea Studies, which is a kind of think tank in China, which is half owned by the Foreign Ministry and half owned by Hainan Province. And he put forward a three-part claim, or three-part basis for China's claim, which is that it claims all the sovereignty over all the features, all the land, the rocks and the reefs inside the U-shaped line. You can disagree with that, but at least that's done in the normal manner of international law. It then enjoys all the rights and jurisdictions defined by UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Convention. Again, all countries who've signed and ratified the treaty should agree with that, even if you can have disputes about the way it's interpreted. Now, the problem is then the third part, that China, in addition to all of the above, enjoys certain historic rights within this line, which are vague and never been defined, that somehow allow China to claim things which go beyond UNCLOS. And the whole point of UNCLOS was to say, we all agree this is the foundation for our legal claims, and we're not going to try and claim anything further. China is going back on UNCLOS, which it signed and indeed ratified in 1996. So Justice Carpio talked about the arbitration ruling, which came 4 years ago. If you like, these two maps are a way of showing the impact of that arbitration. Before the arbitration ruling, China had this vague claim to historic rights within the U-shaped line shown on the left-hand side here. But after the arbitration, basically the arbitration ruling said in effect that China can only claim what it says in UNCLOS, which is 200 nautical miles from its coast. Now, I should say this map is drawing out from the ruling. So, for example, it assumes that the Paracel Islands would be treated the same way as the Spratlys were in the arbitration ruling, but in fact, the Paracels weren't actually part of the case. So it would basically say that China's legitimate exclusive economic zone is that red dotted line close to its coast in the northern part of the sea, up to 200 nautical miles from its coast. The rest of the South China Sea, the right to the resources belongs to the coastal countries, Vietnam, Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, Indonesia, with the exception of little 12 nautical mile radius circles around the land features where the sovereignty is disputed. But everywhere basically outside those darker circles in the right-hand map would be parts of the exclusive economic zones of the coastal states. And that's a neutral, law-based way of resolving the disputes. But of course, China only sees disadvantage from accepting that, which is why it's tried to find other bases for continuing its claim. And the most common cited one that we're hearing at the moment is the idea that China can claim rights based on the 4 shas. Sha is the Chinese word for sands, and in 1933 and then in 1948 the names were revised. China gave the different island or different features of the South China Sea Chinese names, East, West, Central and South sands. There's a bit more complexity to that which I can talk about. But the point is that these 4 shas are supposed to represent these 4 archipelago. One major problem to this is that the Zhongsha, the central sands, doesn't actually exist. It's the results of the Chinese translation errors of the 1930s again. The only above water feature there is the Scarborough Shoal. Macclesfield Bank is underwater. So the idea is that somehow China can claim rights based on these 4 island groups, even though there are actually in fact only 3 island groups. And we started to see this almost immediately after the arbitration results was issued with this article suggesting not so much that the entire island group could generate a claim, but that certain groups of islands within the Spratlys that are close to each other could be treated as a single claim in order to generate an exclusive economic zone. The point was that the tribunal said that the individual islands themselves are not large enough to sustain human habitation, therefore they don't deserve an exclusive economic zone. The Chinese response was to say, well, if we take groups of islands, then collectively they may be able to generate an exclusive economic zone. There's nothing in UNCLOS that says this. Pretty much every non-Chinese international lawyer says this is rubbish. Nonetheless, China continues to assert this. And this is a drawing based, it was done by CSIS in Washington, the Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, where they've tried to show what a claim based on these 4 shas might look like. And as you can see, it goes at least as far as the existing 9-dash line, and in some places even further. So you can see why China would like to push this legal innovation, because it would be a quasi-legal justification for something which they can't currently justify based on the U-shaped line. Now, the question of historic rights is a different legal argument, and it was invented by this man, Professor Fu Quanchen, a Taiwanese academic turned politician, very much a Chinese nationalist. He left the Kuomintang party in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when it started to become more amenable to the idea of Taiwanese autonomy, if not independence. And he is very much a one China guy, so much so that he subsequently moved to Xiamen University in China and in the PRC. And his great contribution to world peace has been to make the South China Sea far more dangerous by giving China a quasi-legal justification to claim rights that go beyond UNCLOS. So in the early 1990s, he tried to persuade Taiwan, Republic of China, to adopt a historic right claim in the South China Sea, and that was rejected. But then he moved to China, and it was actually included within China's 1998 law on its exclusive economic zone. So the word historic rights is there, but no one knows what it means. I mean, it's quite ridiculous that you could say that China you could draw a line in the sea and somehow prove that China had historic rights on one side of the line, but not on the other side of the line. And his evidential basis is, shall we say, very weak. But you can see that this is having a real world impact. This is what happened last year and to some extent this year. Vietnam, this is the southeastern coast of Vietnam with the different oil blocks there, with different oil operations. And this is where the confrontations were. So this is where China was at one point operating its seismic surveys there, and you can see that's the U-shaped line in green there, and it's the areas on the Chinese side, if you like, of the line. That's the areas that were affected by this, and the oil drills that that Vietnam was attempting to organize, which were just on the quotes the wrong side of the green line, have all been pressured by China, and in fact the oil companies were forced to stop their activities there. The U-shaped line there in green, block 0601 is Rosneft, a Russian company, took over from BP. They were forced to stop drilling this year. Repsol, a bit further south and east, they were forced to stop drilling in 2017 and 2018. And Vietnam has just paid or agreed to pay Repsol and another company $1 billion in compensation for stopping them doing that oil drill. So we're saying that China often talks about joint development, but this is the kind of joint development problem. So there's an area, this is an area between central Vietnam and Hainan, where there is no real question of a boundary dispute. It'd be quite easy to draw a median line between China and Vietnam here, but China is refusing to draw the line any further than this tiny little block here, because to do so would be to then start to challenge the direction that the U-shaped line takes further south. So ultimately, I would argue that China really doesn't know what its legal justification for its behavior is in the South China Sea. It's trying various different experiments and is trying to, in effect, reverse engineer an illogical position that emerged out of translation errors in the 1930s, and now trying to find a modern basis that explains the errors that it made during the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Bill Hayton from London. Let me do a quick recap. We have finished 3 topics. We had Captain Carl Schuster from Hawaii, USA, Dr. Carlisle Thayer from Australia, and Mr. Bill Hayton from UK. Right now happening is the first international conference on South China Sea, and we are also live on Facebook. All right, to discuss about the international law and the Philippine national interest, our speaker will be introduced by Engineer Cherito del Carmen, the National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea Japan Country Chair and Asia Regional Chair. Engineer?
Okay, thank you, Ms. Diana Soto. Good afternoon, dear honorable guest speaker and resource speakers. I would like to introduce to you today Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel of Japan. Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel is non-resident adjunct fellow and director of maritime programs at the Pacific Forum. Concurrently, he is also assistant professor of international security studies at Tokyo International University in Japan. He holds a doctorate degree in international relations and specializes in the study of offshore, territorial, and maritime entitlement disputes in Asia. His teaching and research revolve around maritime security and ocean governance, ASEAN regionalism, and broadly, U.S. alliances and engagement in the Indo-Pacific. From 2016 to 2019, he was the holder of the endowed Admiral Joe Vasey Fellowship at the Pacific Forum. And 2019, Dr. Ordaniel convened the Indo-Pacific Maritime Security Expert Working Group, an informal network of select experts and scholars from Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia, and North America, with the aim of generating sound, pragmatic, and actionable policy prescription for the region. He is author of the forthcoming book, Coping with China Threat, the Philippines, Vietnam, and Malaysia in the South China Sea, is scheduled for release in the last quarter of 2020. I would like to present to you our resource speaker from Japan, Dr. Jeffrey Ordeniel.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Ma'am Charito, for the kind introduction. So I'm going to talk about international law and the Philippine national interest, because I think it's important for the Philippines to reappreciate the value of international law and its place in the country's foreign relations. Let me begin by looking at several statements by leaders from various countries. First quote, international disputes should be settled by peaceful means in line with international law and the UN Charter. Dispute concerning the South China Sea should be addressed on the basis of the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. This statement was by Prime Minister Phuc of Vietnam. Next quote, maritime order is not a matter of power, but a matter of the rule of law and one that is rules-based. This was by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan at his address at the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly in 2018. Next quote, we want a free and open Indo-Pacific that is marked by the rule of law. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo of the United States. Lastly, perhaps the most important quote of them all, we should jointly promote the rule of law in international relations. We should urge all parties to abide by international law and well-recognized basic principles governing international relations. We should jointly uphold the authority and sanctity of international law and the international order. Guess who said these words? Believe it or not, the Chinese president. So everyone is talking about the rule of law or adherence to international law. And in the 21st century international order, state actors, including great powers, rationalize their behavior through legal rules and accepted norms of diplomacy, be it unilateral assertions of power, however counterintuitive that may sound, or willingness to cooperate with others to address a pressing international concern. International law is the basis through which states conduct foreign relations. But international law is important because it produces global public goods, right? Such as maritime safety and security, non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and the stability of the global financial others, among many others. In essence, through international law, peace is maintained, interstate cooperation can be deepened, and global prosperity is advanced. International institutions such as UNCLOS, created by and through international law, function to bridge the gaps in intention, right? In an otherwise completely anarchic international order. But outside the Philippines, there is a growing sense that Manila is no longer interested in the rule of law, both internally, domestically within the country, with headline-grabbing news items and extrajudicial killings, and externally, with Duterte's transactional view of the Filipinos' sovereign maritime entitlements. So what is the relevance of international law? What's in it for the Philippines? Since 2016, there has been a growing debate there in Manila on the country's victory in The Hague. Did the Philippines really win against Beijing? Was that even binding? Some politicians there in Manila, especially those who would rather pander to the parochial concerns of President Duterte rather than support their country's national interest, have been saying that the decision to initiate an arbitration was a big mistake. It is easy then to forget that the Philippines was among the leading voices during UNCLOS negotiation. In fact, the archipelagic state regime became part of UNCLOS partly because of the Philippines' leadership. So UNCLOS, just like many international legal instruments, was a product of serious compromises, right? The biggest involves the issue of freedom of navigation and coastal state entitlements. Maybe you've heard of FONOPS in the South China Sea. During UNCLOS negotiation, there was a big debate between the great maritime powers led by the United States and the UK and others, and developing states led by, guess what? China, supported by developing countries like the Philippines. Third world countries or developing countries argued for maximum coastal state entitlements. The maritime powers insisted on freedom of the seas or maximum freedom of the seas. And the result of that was a compromise, right? The EEZ regime. So the reason why we have the EEZ regime now was not because of unilateral assertion by great powers, but rather by a compromise that was made during UNCLOS negotiation. So that is significant because UNCLOS was, in fact, the very first legal or international legal instrument that China has negotiated at the UN. So maybe some would argue that international law, in particular UNCLOS, is a Western invention. That is simply not true. The stability of the international maritime regime, seaborne trade, data communications, and broadly maritime security is underpinned by UNCLOS, which described by many as the constitution of the ocean. And I would argue that UNCLOS is perhaps the fairest international legal instrument of all. Why? Because regardless of your size, regardless of your military strength, influence, and whatnot, you're only allowed of up to 12 nautical miles of territorial waters, up to 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone and continental shelf, and maybe a little bit more of extended continental shelf, but that's it, right? The bottom line is there are so many hard-earned compromises within UNCLOS, and the international community should resist any effort to exempt the South China Sea from UNCLOS. And for any country that is not military powerful, like the Philippines, we rely on international law to preserve our control and occupation of 9 features in the Spratlys and access to waters around those features and beyond. So let me just conclude by offering 6 policy prescriptions that I think the Philippines should pursue. If you've listened to President Duterte recently, I think he emphasized that his country only has 2 options, right? Whether to go to war and be defeated by the Chinese or graciously accommodate Chinese preferences. That, my friends, is a false dichotomy because there are so many things that the Philippines can do and should do to not just protect its national interest in the South China Sea, but advance the rule of law. First, and perhaps the easiest, is for the Philippines to express consistently and frequently its support for freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. As a maritime state disadvantaged by China's 9-dash lines, the Philippines' access to sea lines of communications and maritime resources and trading routes can be vulnerable to the whims of China. So Manila should join Washington, Tokyo, Hanoi, and other like-minded states in preserving freedom of navigation. And if done right, freedom of navigation exercises conducted by the United States, for example, could help counter China's efforts to assert de facto control over the South China Sea and all its economic resources and trade routes. Second, I think it's important for Manila to get back to the 2016 arbitral award and leverage it. In the past, it was just China's words against the Philippines, right? The biggest difference was that China's words were backed by military power. The Philippines backed by nothing. Now that is no longer the case. Now the Philippines' words are backed by a legal determination rendered by a reputable, respected, and competent international legal institution. China's words are still backed by its ability to coerce other states. Third, while there is nothing wrong in jointly exploring and exploiting the oil and gas resources in the South China Sea with China, the Philippines should continue to use the 2016 ruling and not set it aside in trying to extract a better deal that can be compliant with both the Constitution and international law. The ruling can also be a good bottom line through which to pursue international cooperation with neighboring maritime states. So in essence, and I think most of you would agree that any deal with China within the Philippines exclusive economic zone should not and cannot circumvent the Philippine Constitution's Article 12, Section 2, which mandates that the exploration, development, and utilization of natural resources be under the full control and supervision of the state, and that at least 60% of the final profit goes to Filipinos. But the Philippines has the so-called service contract mechanism, right, for large-scale exploration that allows for the participation of foreign entities as contractors governed by Philippine law, and thus exempt from that 60-40 rule. And that could be a face-saving compromise for China, right? To repackage service contracting as joint development for Xi Jinping's domestic audience, for example, especially if operationalized on West Calamian Oil Block, otherwise known as Block 58, inside the 9-dash line, with CNOOC, or the Chinese National Offshore Oil Corporation, as a service contractor. And also China is a party to UNCLOS, so there is no reason, first of all, for China to disagree with this position. Fourth, I think there is a need for the Philippines to look at its interest in the South China Sea and protect and empower Filipino fishermen. I'm not sure if you remember what happened several years ago, or I guess that was last year, in the Recto Bank, right? When Filipino vessels were, Filipino fishing vessels were bumped by Chinese vessels. One report from the Philippine Coast Guard at that time stated that Filipino fishermen were not detailing a designated lookout, which is in violation of Rule 5 of the International Convention, or COLREG, or International Convention Against Collision at Sea. But that was laughable because, I mean, seriously, we expect these people to know international law and their obligations. And so I think the emphasis of the Duterte administration was not the protection of Filipino fishermen, but rather to defend Chinese action. And that is just, that was just repulsive. So I think it's important to empower Filipino fishermen, providing them necessary training on their rights and responsibilities, providing financial aid so they can comply with international conventions and improve their knowledge of Philippine maritime entitlements. Fifth, fast-track Philippine Navy and Philippine Coast Guard modernization, because you cannot rely the security of your country to the benevolence of great powers. And finally, there is a need to strengthen US-Philippine alliance. In the past, this was ambiguous, right? The American commitment to the defense of the Philippines in the South China Sea. I remember in 2012, after the Scarborough Shoal standoff, the Philippines had a difficult time convincing Washington to clarify exactly the coverage of the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty vis-a-vis the South China Sea. Now we see American policy shifting. Washington last year clarified for the first time its commitment with the Philippines in the South China Sea per Article 4 and 5 of their Mutual Defense Treaty. Last week, while maintaining neutrality on sovereignty issues concerning land features in the South China Sea, the United States took a position on maritime entitlement disputes and completely aligned its position with the 2016 Arbitral Tribunal Award. So I think these things that we have been asking for America to do, they have been doing. Unfortunately, there seems to be very little interest in the Philippines to leverage the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty to deter further Chinese assertiveness in the South China Sea. I would also argue that strengthening US-Philippine alliance also mean maybe encouraging America to take a position on the Scarborough Shoal, which, by the way, was used by the US military in the past as a target and bombing range. Doing so would be the strongest deterrent against any potential land reclamation by the Chinese. So again, Article 4 and 5 of the US-Philippines Mutual Defense Treaty covers the South China Sea, in particular Filipino troops, public vessels, aircraft, and occupied features. And the Philippines should leverage that, always emphasize that, to deter further Chinese expansionism, because frankly, there is really no stopping the Chinese from pushing the envelope in the South China Sea. So deterrence is very important. So overall, I think it is time for the Philippines to put the pursuit of the rule of law back into its foreign policy. Unfortunately, in the past 4 years, I think we have been seeing Manila prioritizing the parochial interests, parochial concerns of President Duterte, and that is just sad. But 2022 election is coming, so maybe we can see some changes in the next several years. I'll end it here. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.
That was a discussion of the international law and the Philippine national interest, courtesy of Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel from Japan. Thank you so much, sir. Moving on to our fifth speaker for today to discuss a P-and-down model for a South China Sea solution in the escalating Sino-US rivalry. We have our speaker, and I will introduce our next speaker because Ms. Eleanor is not around. We have Dr. Dean Hoang Thanh, Director of Center for Information and International Cooperation at the Vietnam Institute of Development Studies in Hanoi, Vietnam. Please welcome Dr. Dean Hoang Thanh. Dr. Dean, your mic is off. Kindly turn it on so everybody can hear you. Dr. Dean is live right now. There you go.
Yes. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, sir.
Can I begin?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Dear colleagues and ladies and gentlemen, what the news after 4 years of the CPA decision in the cause of the Philippines against China? I want to mention here a very new article with the title, The South China Sea Issue and Vietnam-US Relation. This is an article written by Dr. Lai Thai-Binh of the South China Sea Research Institute. This institute belongs to the Vietnamese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he has proposed two unprecedented possibility for cooperation in the bilateral relationship between Vietnam and the United States, as below. Number one, Vietnam and the US can work together in close cooperation with the regional countries like the Philippines and the other ASEAN members and the whole world to create an annual high-level security forum. I repeat, an annual high-level security forum to discuss and resolve raising issues in the South China Sea. And number two, the two countries can promote cooperation regarding capacity building in trading, coaching, joint drill, and information exchange for the developments in the South China Sea, such as economic cooperation, scientific research, marine environment protection, prevent terrorism, piracy, and natural disaster relief at sea. That semi-official proposal from a Vietnamese agency, as an agency belonging to the MOFA, came on July 17, 4 days after the call of the US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo for action in response to illegally bullying behaviors of the China that threat the small country in the region. Concerning the first possibility, Vietnam likely to continue internalizing the South China Sea issue that make China upset. The penetrating standpoint of the Beijing is that they just want to see this dispute be resolved bilaterally with the claimant, including Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Brunei. In his second possibility, Dr. Lai is looking for the stronger presence of the US in the region to not only strengthen the capacity of each stakeholder through the service training, but also go further via joint military exercise and information exchange concerning development in the South China Sea. Today, as observer of the tension that easily escalated into the conflict on the South China Sea, I want to remind a feasible solution previously proposed to Vietnamese government for South China Sea issue, including the response to the China other claimant. I name it the P&R paradigm. We stand for, first, strengthening system with external partners as P, and the second, promoting the process of the democratization as mean D, and three, organizing and combining legal battle with the media war as O, and fourth, approaching to balancing policy as W, and fifth, making advantage of the network of the free trade area. Agreement is meant networking, N. But P and D as a two main failure of the system. I believe P&R model should be a comprehensive approach for the current tension in the South China Sea. However, every single component of the solution must always be updated to confirm the reality when it comes to practice. P stands for partnership as a strategic or comprehensive partner system. It is the right time for Vietnam to upgrade the comprehensive partnership in the Vietnam-US relation. On 25th anniversary of the establishment of official diplomatic relations between Vietnam and the US, this issue has been unfortunately not implemented yet. Since both objective and subjective circumstances are appreciated for upgrade. The current paradox is that the longer strategic ambiguity, the more and more Vietnam will be bullied and restrained by China. To encounter the international and regional complexity during the past 4 years, Vietnam must enhance its defense capability. concerning the escalation of the Chinese military activities and base expansion in the South China Sea, Vietnam should not stand up alone. The perspective of the US policymaker is very clear. Progress on human rights issue and the guarantee of the rule of law will generate a solid foundation for the deeper and more sustainable strategy beside of the strategic partnership between Vietnam and the US. The matter here, obviously, like in Vietnam, must be solved by its own. The Vietnam should acknowledge that Americans just want to guarantee their engagement to countries that share some certain value with them. In new context, the military philosophy that Vietnam have placed their faith in since the end of the Cold War should be altered, focusing on diversification, multilateralization, and full integration. As a matter of fact, the strategic and comprehensive partnership system reflects a trend of the establishment of the soft alliance in the era of globalization and regionalization. However, whether P can reach its full potential is a story depending on the inner strength of Vietnam. Regarding the element as democratization, it refers to the country democratization to mobilize the massive soft power hidden in its civil society. The history of social democratization in Vietnam, its rise and fall should be discussed in another specific talk. In here, I highlight the role of the people and civil society that should not be restricted in the course of the sea and island protection. Vietnam and other ASEAN members still have to continue the negotiation COC, visit China, time fishing game. Vietnam will sit on the chair of SEAN for a year, but China has been conducting its plot for the decades. That is an immediate and long-term challenge that Vietnam and ASEAN must overcome. O in OPC, O in the model stand for organizing the COC negotiation, legal framework, and media method. The harmonious combination of these key elements will make national wisdom to connect or networking with the free and open Indo-Pacific according to AOIP, awareness of Vietnam and ASEAN on FOI, free and open Indo-Pacific. In the outbreak of COVID-19, analysts have witnessed the peak of escalation in the US-China relation that wouldn't be reversed. There are many reasons for the outlook, but Beijing, in striking departure from the only diplomatic track record, has been taking much harder line on the international stage than usual, making the most regular observer wonder whether China's foreign policy has fundamentally changed. From Vietnam, the 30th Congress of Vietnamese Communist Party will take place in early 2021. A new generation of Vietnamese leaders, many of them are old, will pilot the country. We haven't known yet if there is any turning point in the policy making, especially the foreign policy of Vietnam. A strong leadership of new thinking should be the matter. As philosopher Blaise Pascal once said, the man is thinking read. The transformation in our mind will give us immeasurable power. On the other hand, the new Vietnamese policymaker need to realize the predensiting relationship between the P and D. With a stronger partner system, it is inevitable that the country will face non-stop threats from the outside. Though social democratization is must. Society governed by totalitarianism system cannot share the value of freedom with advanced country community. Isolation will directly threaten both traditional and non-traditional security. But P and D can also stand for OWN. It is a synergy of the strength by media, legal, and the appearance of the Vietnam in the world political stage. The Embassy of Vietnam in the US, Europe, in ASEAN country and other countries should establish public channel at the locality. Many other different events were organized, such as international workshop or like our conference today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dinh Huong Thanh from Hanoi, Vietnam. He discussed the model for our South China Sea solution and the escalating Sino-US rivalry. Now, moving on to our sixth speaker for today to discuss about the Permanent Court of Arbitration Award on the South China Sea and its impact on Indonesia. Our next speaker will be introduced by Ms. Malu Hermida, the National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea Chair for Cainta Rizal. Do we have Ms. Malu? All right, I will be.
Okay, hello. Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Our next speaker, he is a senior lecturer at the Faculty of Law, University Indonesia. Besides teaching duties, currently he is also the chairman of Center for International Law Studies and Center for Sustainable Ocean Policy Faculty Law, Universities Indonesia. The editor-in-chief of Indonesia, Journal of International Law, the editor-in-chief of Indonesia Yearbook of International Law, and editor of ASEAN Journal of Community Engagement. He is also the president of Indonesian Society of International Law Lecturers and executive council member of the ASEAN Society of International Law. He obtained his Bachelor in Law, Sarjana Hukum, in August 2003 from Faculty of Law, Universitas Indonesia. In December 2006, he received the degree of Master of International Law from the University of Sydney Law School, Australia. Finally, he obtained his doctorate degree in law, PhD, at the Faculty of Law, University of Otago, New Zealand, in August 2013. It's my honor to introduce to you none other than Dr. Ari Afriancia.
Okay, hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Okay, all right, thank you very much, and I'm sorry for this event because I have to be on the road in my car because today is in Indonesia, it's a holiday of Sacrifice Day. But it's an honor for me to give my presentation in front of all the participants. But first, I would like to express my thanks to the organizers, especially to Dr. Celia, to invite me for this event. And also, I would like to say hello to Justice Caprio. Last year we tried to invite you, but unfortunately, no, this year actually, earlier this year, we would like to have a seminar about the UNCLOS anniversary, but unfortunately, because of the pandemic, you have to cancel the trip to Jakarta. But hopefully next time we will have you in Jakarta. Ladies and gentlemen, today I would like to present quite different with the previous speakers, because I will talk more on Indonesian side. As you may aware that Indonesia is a non-claimant state in South China, but still the PCA award has some impacts on Indonesia. So, so please next slide. Next slide, please. And we can jump off to the second slide. Oh, this is just me. Yeah. So as you may know that the award of the PCA this year has reached its fourth anniversary, and it has been discussed by the previous participants about the importance of this award. And if we take a look again at the decisions, at least the award have decided that the Chinese claim on historic rights by 9 dash lines has no basis under international law and thus unlawful. Secondly, islands on Spratlys cannot generate EEZ or continental shelf entitlement. Nevertheless, the tribunal did not determine which states own the feature, but it declares the status of Michif and Second Thomas Shoal as on attached elevation and are not capable of appropriation. And thus, it is solved and it is part of the Philippines EEZ. Next. How about Indonesia? Yeah. Next, please. Yeah. We know that the award is binding only to the parties. Yeah, that is the China and the Philippines. And in this case, Indonesia is not the case party, and it is not the claimant state over the South China Sea disputes. However, it remains relevant to Indonesia because, one, Indonesia is party to UNCLOS, and therefore it's bound by the provisions and the implementation of UNCLOS. Secondly, the tribunal interprets, and it is authorized to do so by certain provisions, and therefore it is also Indonesia also bound by this as well. And Indonesia shall not necessarily be bound by the word because it's not the party, but it's bound by the UNCLOS party as interpreted by the tribunal. Next, please. Yeah, and as we know that it is important for Indonesia to comply with the UNCLOS because it has been our practice since our independence that we try to comply with international, and indeed we try international law to defend our existence. We know that as early as our independence, we have been tried that we have to defend our independence from the aggression from the Dutch and also from the British. And then Indonesia, as a party of UNCLOS, we have so much benefit from the UNCLOS, and therefore we also at the same time have to be consistent with the provisions of UNCLOS. And therefore, it has been consistent that Indonesia is on the position to not recognize China's historic claims or 9-dash claims as explained by the previous speakers. And it is clear that if Indonesia be in violation of UNCLOS provisions, if it accepts to negotiate maritime delimitation that recognize the 9-dash lines applicable to North Natuna waters. As you may aware that Indonesia in 2017 has claimed that some of waters in the northern part, Natuna Island of Indonesia, as part of Indonesian EEZ. And we are now actually only recognize our overlapping with Vietnam. So in this case, if we are accepting the Chinese invitation to negotiate, therefore we are acknowledging that the basis of the Chinese is lawful. But up until now, the Indonesian government has been consistent to reject any invitation to negotiate with the Chinese government. Next, please. In terms of the relevance for Indonesia, the award, we know that it does not solve the disputes up until now, actually, but it does clarify some issues. Yeah, and the tribunal confirms that no EEZ or continental shelf generated from any feature in Spratlys, and then coastal state could only claim EEZ or continental shelf by using the base points of their mainlands. And as consequences, there will be some areas of high seas with navigation freedom of all states, as has been discussed by the previous speakers, that there will be freedom of navigation. And despite that, Indonesia again as non-climate state, however, we can see in a number of events Chinese try to in order to make, or I don't know, maybe try to get Indonesia involved. Hello.
Hello,
Next.
sir. Please continue.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Hello. Hello.
We're
Hello.
playing the next slide, sir. We're already on the next slide.
But on my screen it's not yet. Sorry. Okay. Never mind. So you can see from the slide maybe there's yes, that's right. There's two news that I took from the internet. It shows that on December 2019 and on July 2020, and both of the events are where the Chinese Coast Guard or Chinese fishing vessels, accompanied by the Coast Guard, trying to get into the Indonesian EEZ, yeah. But Indonesian authorities trying to make the what do you call it, the assertion is not accepted to Indonesian. That's why we deploy our military forces and also our Coast Guards into the area. And we also try to mobilize a group of fishers, innocent fishers, to fish in that area. So we try to make our presence clear to the Chinese that we are defending our territory, and we are not recognizing any Chinese intrusion to our EEZ. Yeah. And Indonesia has been consistent protesting any Chinese claim in international forum. As you can see in the next slide, please, in the International Committee extension of the Committee on Continental Shelf, that we have submitted 2 note verbals to responding to Chinese claim. That if you can see in the next slide, please. We reiterate that Indonesia is not party to the territorial dispute. However, Indonesia notes that in its concerning maritime entitlements, as reflected, yeah, in the award between the Chinese and the Philippines, that there's no maritime features. Yeah, and the Indonesian reiterates that the 9-land map claims clearly lacks international legal basis and is tantamount to upset the UNCLOS 92. So Indonesia again trying to bash any Chinese claim for its claim over the South China Sea. And the next note verbal that is dated on June 12, June 2020, again, Indonesia also answering the Chinese claim by saying that no historic rights exist in Indonesian EEZ and continental shelf. Should there be any historic rights existing prior to the entry into force of UNCLOS, those rights were superseded by the provisions of UNCLOS 1982. So both claims of the 9-line and the historic maritime rights, Indonesia has rejected those claims. And despite that, this is only like without any military forces. In my opinion, the the note, the diplomatic verbal is implying a consistent and strong words to give a clear message to the Chinese government that Indonesia is consistent in supporting the PCA tribunal. And finally, on my notes, next slide, please. The PCA award is an unclosed award, yeah, and thus states should comply without political reservation. Despite the rejection to the award by a state, and this case is China, it remains an award of legal settlement. It is worth of significant legitimate weight under international law. Therefore, any action using force and coercion on the to overturn intention to challenge the award, the effort could only be done by another proceeding, such as new treaty norms or norms developed in customary international law. Indonesia, again, is remain consistent to its policy and should always vigilance on any development on the area. And hopefully, if Indonesia can do more active, pushing any peaceful settlement, yeah, in the area, that would be a strong leadership of Indonesia within an ASEAN itself. However, we with the current escalation by the Chinese and also by the West in the area, I think Indonesia still calculating the price or the cost that might be bear by Indonesia if Indonesia play more active in this event. I guess I'm open to question and answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ari, on the road right now. Ladies and gentlemen, that was Dr. Ari from Indonesia, laying down the impact on Indonesia of the Permanent Court of Arbitration Award on the South China Sea. Dr. Ari, I hope you can stay with us. We'll have the open forum shortly. All right, thank you so much. All right, for our last speaker to talk about the geopolitics of the South China Sea, a Malaysian scholar's perspective, our next resource speaker will be introduced by Ms. Norm Silvestre, the National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea Global Secretariat.
Yana. Good afternoon, everyone. Our guest speaker is from Malaysia. She is a senior lecturer in the Strategic Studies and International Relations program at the National University of Malaysia, UKM. She is concurrently co-founder and convener of the East Asia and International Relations Caucus at UKM. She was 2017 Shangri-La Dialogue Southeast Asian Young Leaders Program Associate Research Fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. She was also the Korea Foundation Field Research Fellow at the Seoul National University in 2010, and Academy of Korean Studies Research Fellow in 2011. Her main research interests include South Korean foreign policy, North Korean provocations, IR theory, and Korea-Southeast Asian relations. She is currently leading a Korea Foundation-funded project on Southeast Asia-North Korea relations, examining the security, economic linkages, and strategic uncertainties of North Korean security challenges in the region. She is consulted by Malaysian and international media on Korean security issues which appear in English, Mandarin mediums, including BBC News, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, South China Sea Morning Post, China Review, Sinchu Daily, and among others. Without further ado, Let's welcome Dr. Ho Ching-Pei. Welcome, Dr. Ho.
Thank you so much for your very kind introduction. And after that introduction, some of you may have wondered why am I here. So there are actually some of my colleagues who can speak better on this South China Sea issues. But nonetheless, I'm going to present what as an academic I would think about the geopolitics of the South China Sea. So in response to one of the Q&A question as to why Malaysia has been quite silent on the South China Sea disputes. And actually just as of yesterday, last night, our government, the government of Malaysia has submitted a note verbal to the United Nations, so of which I would present later and explain that we are not as quiet as our other neighbor thinks we are. So allow me to share my presentation. So what I'm going to present today, I hope you can see it. Can you see the presentation now? Oh no, I think it's...
Yes, ma'am, we can see it.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
Yeah, so I thought that it wasn't working, so sorry about that. So let me just try again. All right, so basically there are three major overlapping dimensions on the South China Sea. So firstly is our diplomatic stance on the South China Sea among the claimant states and now including the non-claimant states such as Indonesia. And secondly, there are security considerations about the myriads of traditional and non-traditional security threats. And thirdly, of course, as all of you are legal experts here today, so I have learned a lot from your presentation, and I would like to...
Dr. Chu,
yes?
Are you sharing your screen already?
Yeah, that's what I think so, but it's...
Press the share screen button. There. Now we see it.
Right, okay, sure. So, so these are the three major dimensions that I'm talking about just now. So let's move on to the why it was so complicated for us to move forward. So firstly, it is because of the diplomatic stance that we have trouble with. And firstly, it's about the domestic leadership. So I formulate this argument: authority, asymmetry, and autonomy based on my great colleague Kwek Cheng-Thu's work. So why would smaller states have difficulty in projecting a very consistent position? So especially among the democratic governments, as government change, we may have different interests to take into account when we are projecting our policy stance, especially towards South China Sea, where there are great powers invested their interests and spreading their influence in the region. So smaller states ruling coalition is not just about the government, but also the military, the lobby, and the public interests, and also other areas such as economy and energy interests. So this is why we have myriads of responses to both the United States and China. So, and this projected a kind of asymmetry power balancing as well. So the first few speakers has already explained about this dimension, so I will not go into that. So thirdly is about our sense of autonomy over our territorial waters and how do we perceive the risks and opportunities if we are to support, say, the recent US statements on the South China Sea and also China's approach. As all of us have bilateral relations with China, and some of us are the recipients of the Belt and Road initiatives, and also China ASEAN also had the maritime military exercise and so on. So there are layers of reason why as to we have this shifting diplomatic stance, as Dr. Jeffrey O'Daniel has also explained on the Philippines' position on the South China Sea as well. So secondly, this under the diplomatic dimension is the unresolved bilateral disputes among the claimant states themselves. And I'm referring specifically all the claimant states aside from China. So we still have some outstanding water disputes between Malaysia, Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so on and so forth. But over the past 2 decades, I would say that we have managed to reach some understanding. We are resolving our many overlapping claims one by one. And this actually shows a very positive trend as to where ASEAN claimant states will move forward on the South China Sea issues. And of course, last but not least, the action-reaction among the major powers has always been on the smaller states' mind when we make decision and reaction about the South China Sea issues. So since last year, we have seen Chinese Coast Guard ship presence in Vietnamese water, and earlier this year in Malaysia's. So the South China Sea standoffs actually has increased tension in this area, in which the United States, despite under the pandemic constraint, has sent its military vessels to the area. So the message of support could be welcome, and it is important. However, it would be better if such movement or action can be informed to the local government first. So as to the US position on maritime claim that has been just revealed more than a week ago, that they strongly worded that China's claim in the South China Sea is illegal, and that they stand behind ASEAN states on the South China Sea. So all of this, you would realize that we have also a spectrum of different responses towards the US statement as well. So this is not as easy as choosing side or not choosing side. This is about each of the government need to perceive the risk coming from a very strong worded statement, and also what kind of opportunity that we can seize to maintain our sovereignty, projecting our autonomy while still preserving the economic interests with all parties involved. So the second dimension of security, I would focus on the maritime security. So as I said just now, the increased military presence has induced worries among the smaller states in this region, and increased presence of the Chinese Coast Guard vessels is quite a headache to be dealt with by all the governments here. And as in the example of the Chinese and Vietnamese standoff is the disruptions of the oil and gas activities. So Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and also to the other end of the 9-dash line, Indonesia, we all have oil and gas activities explored in the southern area, in which China has frequently incurred and also harassed the activities, but the most severe one is on the Vietnamese side. Whereas on the Filipino side, it's especially in the Scarborough Shoal region, the underlying problems of maritime security involving South China Sea is actually what I think is the biggest elephant in the room, the illegal fishing and the fishing ground dispute that has not been adequately addressed in many forms, I would say. So for that, that leads to the legal disputes. So over the years, and as Professor Charles Thayers has presented so succinctly, comprehensively about the development of the dispute and UNCLOS application, there are so many contending interpretations about what does it mean, and China also come up with their very strong legal team, and just like what Bill Hayton has said, they become very creative and innovative about interpretation of the law. So the Arbitral Ruling Award 2016 actually lays the foundation for law-based solutions to territorial water disputes. And that, I think, all of the ASEAN claimant states should slowly rally behind. So you will notice that, for one, Malaysia did not express a very strong opinion about the Arbitral Ruling Award. China's evolving legal claims and approach recently warrant the rest of the claimant states and Southeast Asian nations to pay attention to the increasingly bold moves by China, which includes its internal reform. So they have shifted the China Coast Guard away from the Ocean Administration and put them under the Central Military Commission, in which leads to the militarization of CCG. And in April this year, establishment of the 2 new administrative structures in the South China Sea, the Xisha and Nansha. And as Bill has explained just now as well, there is also a Zhongsha right now, so which is really, really worrying. So CLCS, the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, submissions by the claimant states and also by the non-claimant states become some of the very recent development as to how we can rally our voice together against a kind of assertion and aggression that has been developing. So even more quiet than Malaysia, I would say, is Brunei. And even Brunei has released a very rare statement on the South China Sea last week. So Brunei has strongly worded that peace and stability should be pursued in the area of South China Sea. So it should be based on mutual trust and, of course, support for the Code of Conduct negotiation on the South China Sea. And as for Malaysia, yesterday, so we just submitted this not verbal to the United Nations. So you can find this under the CLCS website right now. So we reject China's historical interpretation and also legal claims over the areas of the South China Sea where we have overlap claims. And we also request all parties to stick to the UNCLOS interpretation. So the only downside of this not verbal is that we did not, the Malaysian government did not mention arbitral ruling specifically. So that could be a future state for the steps for the government to consider, so that we can assert our autonomy in a stronger way. So what is the future prospect and trends for the South China Sea to envelop? So I would not repeat what has been said by the previous speakers. I particularly wanted to note on many of the Dr. Jeffrey O'Daniel's policy recommendation, because we need to do something that has not been taken or discussed among ourselves in ASEAN. So the first and foremost, I think, would be the bilateral disputes among the ASEAN claimant states themselves, especially the fishing ground. Malaysia government has a very big problem in managing illegal fishing coming from Vietnam and also from Indonesia. I think Indonesia has increasingly very refined in their approach, I would say, legally, especially around the North Natuna Sea. So that actually presents a kind of an example of how we can assert our, and also resolve our territory dispute by making clear of many of these overlapping claims among ourselves, because China has been using those disunity to kind of divide us on the South China Sea issue, and probably during the COC negotiation as well. So we need to resolve that before we can take the next step, which is to project a principal position on the South China Sea, and also eventually recognizing the 2016 Arbitral Ruling Award. So last but not least, of course, we need to support of all cooperative mechanisms and reject all forms of confrontation. Only then we can manage to maintain peace and stability in the South China Sea. Thank you so much for your attention. I hereby end my presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hu Chu from Malaysia. Dr. Hu just gave her perspective on the geopolitics of South China Sea. And there you go. That's the 7 of our esteemed resource speakers for today's conference, all coming from different parts of the globe: Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, UK, Australia, and Hawaii. At this point, we officially open the forum. We have questions coming in from our attendees here in the Zoom conference, as well as questions from our audience on the Facebook live feed. We have our moderator here, Dr. Zhao N. Huang from the Faculty of Law, Vietnam National University, Hanoi, Vietnam. Hello, Dr. Zhao.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, Dr. Zhao,
Yeah.
we can hear you.
Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am very pleased to join this forum and very, very helpful. And I think this is very important. I have heard, our speakers on various topics related to the South China Sea. Or I either prefer to, call the Asian Sea. Okay, it might be more, reflects more the reality geographically. But now let's start with the open forum, with the discussion. Throughout on the speeches that we have heard, I would like to raise some question or maybe some topic for discussion. The first one I would like to I quite share the point of view about the one of the things that we might do is about the bilateral dispute among claimants between, let's say, Vietnam, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia. Okay, on the issue related to the sea areas and the resources. And my question is, do you think that is time and it's a very good, circumstances that we, the Asian country, the coastal Asian country to the South China Sea, to start with the bilateral, negotiation to settle by ourselves the issues related to the sea area of resources. This is one question. The second one question I would like to raise is what is given the current circumstances, especially the latest developments of the official diplomatic foreign policy by US, by Australia, and by coastal country to the South China Sea, very strongly confirmed the need that the disputes should be solved accordingly international law and UNCLOS 1982. And under these circumstances, what do you think we as a coastal country, Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei, what we should, do in order to secure maritime security as well as to protect our sovereign rights and sovereignty over our sea areas? This is the second question I would like to raise for discussion. The third thing.
Dr. Zhao, do you want to address your questions to a specific speaker?
Yes, I just address this.
Okay.
The first question is about, is it time for our negotiation of the claimant countries, coastal, South China Sea, except China? Okay, China is not, in terms of the legal term, China is not a claimant for the South China Sea, I would say. I must say that. And The second question is what we coastal country should do, take the action or should do together in order to secure maritime security and to protect our sovereign rights, sovereignty, and in the areas of given by UNCLOS 1982. This is the second question. The third question about the COC. Do we think that COC helps for to maintain the maritime security, stability in the region? Do we believe that? The third question. And the fourth question is about the US role for Philippines, for Vietnam, for Malaysia in the South China Sea, situation in order to maintain the stability and the freedom of navigation and air navigation, as well as to protect the sovereign rights over the natural resources of the coastal countries.
All right,
This is a
Dr.
four
Zhao,
question. Okay.
Let's see if the Honorable Justice would like to answer Dr. Zhao's
Please.
question.
Please.
Is Justice Carpio still around?
Yes. Okay. I think, yes, on settling the overlapping claims of Vietnam and the Philippines and Malaysia, I think the Vietnamese Prime Minister offered to our President a year ago to demarcate our overlapping extended continental shelf beyond the EEZs. And it's not difficult because you just get the median line. But unfortunately, our President has not taken up the offer, probably because he doesn't want to offend China. So that is still there. And I think the next administration in the Philippines might take up that offer because it doesn't require any rocket science. It's just a median line that you will use. Also, Malaysia has offered to demarcate its adjacent exclusive economic zone in the Philippines, and that was offered during the administration of President Aquino, but there was some misunderstanding within the administration of President Aquino. That's why it didn't put so. But I think that misunderstanding has been clarified because the claim of the Sultan of Sulu does not face the South China Sea. It faces the Sulu Sea and the Celebes Sea. So there is no conflict there. So actually, we have an opinion already by our UP Law Center that there is no conflict. We can demarcate our adjoining EEZ with Malaysia facing the South China Sea without involving our dispute on Sabah. So I think there is no major obstacle to signing these sea boundary agreements, but I think we need a fresh administration in the Philippines to do that. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Justice Carpio. There's another question for you, sir. Coming from Ms. Trina Lopez from Canada. I will read it. What is the pulse of the Filipino people on the issue on the West Philippine Sea 4 years later? Are there still passion on the Filipino people in fighting this since they see the government with Duterte seem to have given up the West Philippine Sea sovereignty to China? How can we make sure the Filipinos in the Philippines and across the world will keep on fighting and not feel hopeless fighting for the West Philippine Sea despite lack of the support from Duterte administration?
Well, I think if you look at the SWS survey, the level of support from the Filipino people has remained very high, over 70%. And I think because we have been talking about this, we have been explaining this in universities and in other fora, I think that level of support has been increasing. But of course, President Duterte does not want to offend China, and so he's not going to do anything about it. But we must prepare for the next administration because this is a long game. I mean, this will not be solved during this administration, not maybe even the next administration, but we have to develop a consensus within the Philippines, within ASEAN, within the world, so that we will educate the Chinese people that this historical narrative of the Chinese government that they own the South China Sea since 2,000 years ago is totally false. I think our problem is that the Chinese government cannot comply with the ruling because they have taught the Chinese people from grade 1 to college that they own the South China Sea since 2,000 years ago. And if they comply with the ruling, they might be thrown out. They might be overthrown by the Chinese people because the government is giving away sacred territory. So we need to talk directly to the Chinese people, but we have to educate ourselves first. What are the issues? Why are the claims of China false? And then we can bring it up with the Chinese people. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice. There's another question here, if you may answer again, sir. Can we have UN peacekeeping mission in the West Philippine Sea to maintain peace and order? This is coming from Facebook live feed.
Well, unfortunately, a UN peacekeeping mission requires approval of the Security Council. And China has a veto power there. And I don't think China will approve it.
Okay. Thank you, sir. That was from Oscar Oreta. We have more questions. How about you, Dr. Zhao? Let me see here. I think we have another question coming from our attendees. Anybody can give their opinion and comment. Here it is from, this is from Ross Jervin Lawrence Ruiz. What strategic plans and or steps are in place by nearby non-claimant states to help enforce the UNCLOS in the South China Sea? Emphasis on neighbors like Japan, South Korea, India, and Australia. So this question is for non-claimant states. Anybody can give their opinion from their speakers.
If I can, we deal with that here. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
We deal with that here. One of the things that is developing as a result of China's actions is India has expanded its partnership with other countries. India now, the Indian Navy now exercises with Japanese, Australian, and US forces in the Malabar series. And so what we're seeing is a strengthening set of partnerships in maritime operations related to the South China Sea. So you're going to see more Australian operations in the South China Sea. You're going to see more, of course, you're already seeing more American. You're also going to see some Japanese transits and so forth through there. In terms of strategic plans, there is not a tradition of coalition warfare in Asia. And as a result, you have a series of bilateral agreements and bilateral discussions on what people will do or consider if one of the other participants or partners is under threat. We have a treaty with the Philippines, the Mutual Defense Treaty with the Philippines. It's one of our longest standing treaties. And we have just now begun to clarify our position of support for the Philippines in the East Philippine Sea and the South China Sea. My hope is, and I know it's being discussed in the administration, is we want to work our partnerships and strengthen our relationships with the countries in Southeast Asia and the non-claimant countries that are in a position to help, who also have a very deep interest in the South China Sea. When you think about it, 40% of Japan's trade goes through the South China Sea, a similar percentage for South Korea. So whatever happens in the South China Sea affects those countries, so they are not disinterested. And so if we can build on those partnerships, we can, if not develop a united effort for consistent policy and freedom in the South China Sea, at least introduce the possibility of an expanded opposition to bullying in the South China Sea. And that provides a deterrent calculation to Chinese actions. At least that would be the hope. And that's kind of where the discussions are going. What can you do? What would you do? What is your position type of talks?
Thank you, Captain Carl. While I have you here, there's another question that maybe you'd be interested to answer. This is coming from Isagani Kanya. Why not rebuild another U.S. military base in the Philippines?
Well, that's not a unilateral question. We do have base access at Clark Air Force Base, what used to be Clark Air Force Base. We negotiated an access agreement with the Philippines. The visiting forces agreement still remains in place, although President Duterte has talked about canceling it. The challenge that we face in the Philippines is some of the more embarrassing aspects of our past relationship that has generated some resentment at a popular level. There's also a level of distrust. You heard during one of the earlier presentations about the lack of clarity of our policy towards the South China Sea in past years. I was involved in the Mutual Defense Board discussions in 1996 after the first Chinese seizure, if you will, of Philippine territory. And our State Department specifically told us that under no circumstances were we to assure the Philippines of our support in a South China Sea dispute, that we had no position on it, and that the Mutual Defense Treaty did not extend beyond the Philippines' main islands. General Reyes, the late General Reyes, who was the J2 for the Philippines at the time, was a close personal friend. And the impact of that policy statement cannot be understated. He saw it, although he didn't say anything, they saw it, you could tell by their eyes, as a betrayal of the treaty. Philippines had fought beside us in Korea and in Vietnam. And now when they needed us, our position was, it's between you and the other countries. We're not involved. The one good thing that's happened in the last 7 years is we recognize that our credibility with our partners and allies is dependent upon their ability to rely on us. Unfortunately, our past practices have induced an element of distrust. Are we reliable or not? We like to think we are. We're doing everything we can to maintain the commitments we've made, but you cannot deny the past. And the past, we're all prisoners of our past. And breaking free of it means new commitment, new actions. It's my belief that if the Philippines allows us, we should start doing staging of aircraft and things to Clark Air Force Base and expanded port visits in and out of Subic to physically demonstrate that we're back as an ally. Because imagery does matter. Physical demonstrations do matter. As to rebuilding a base infrastructure, I don't see it. I don't think the Philippines really wants that. I think the Philippine people want us to come when they need us, but they don't want us to be an occupying power. And so it's a balancing act for both countries. If that makes sense.
Thank you, Captain. Anybody else from the speakers would like to make a comment on that? All right. Well, let's move on. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Yes, Sir Ari.
Yes, I just want to make comment on how we're going to move on with this dispute. I guess as a non-climate said, as Dr. Chiu-Ping already illustrated, I think this is the moment that, especially for Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia, to settle their maritime boundaries. Therefore, the Chinese cannot have any room for intrusion and to, let's say, divide between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. So having having a clear and definitive boundary agreement. Therefore, it will be closing the Chinese movement trying to make any further claims over the area. I guess that's my comment. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Next question from Gus Mercado from Texas. This is for Justice Carpio. What we see in the US are conflicting and ambiguous positions of the Philippine government. On the other hand, President Duterte and Defense Minister Lorenzana declared the Philippines strong objections to China's intrusions in the West Philippine Sea, warning severe reactions. On the other hand, is the Philippines' seeming capitulation of China's aggressive moves, bullying and construction of facilities on the disputed islands. The president is quoted as doing double speak on the issue. What is the real story and where does the Philippines stand on this all-important problem?
Well, the president has said that he will put aside the arbitral ruling in exchange for investments and loans from China because he wants to fund his build project. But that's all gone because he had less than 2 years. And I think China has a problem delivering on those loans. It takes time. There are bidding requirements, getting the consent of the people on the ground. So people here don't see build being funded now by China. So I think the president made a mistake there by betting that he can get money from China in exchange for freezing the ball on the West Philippine Sea. But, the president still doesn't want to assert the ruling, maybe because he said he loves President Xi Jinping, and President Xi Jinping is there to protect him in case someone wants to oust him from office. So we're stuck with that. So we have to prepare for the next round when there's a new president 2 years from now. What we have to do now is to preserve our rights under this arbitral ruling. As long as we preserve our rights, we can still recover. And we educate ourselves, we educate everybody, our ASEAN neighbors, the world, so that we can discuss this issue with the Chinese people. Because at the end of the day, this is a matter of convincing the Chinese people that their claim is totally fake. Because until the Chinese people understand that, their government will not comply with the ruling. Thank you.
My comment on this, I think it is of course the Chinese people need to be educated because the Chinese Communist Party propaganda they started with very little schoolboys and girls about the rise over South China Sea, and not only inside China but outside China. So I don't think that we need to think much about the understanding or awareness of the people in China. Here, I think this is important for the countries to stand up and unify and to fight for their own legitimate the rights given by UNCLOS 1982. This is very important. Not rely on the awareness of the people, Chinese people, because of the Chinese Communist Party, they for about 100 years already, they educated the people about the rise over South China Sea.
If I may. Hello?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, if I may, I think it is important to understand that Duterte's South China Sea policy is largely based on his parochial concerns and mindset. In particular, his very favorable view of China and unfavorable view of the United States. Take, for example, his initial decision to terminate the visiting forces agreement with the US. That was not a result of a deliberative process. There was no strategizing whatsoever. He did not even consult his foreign policy and national security teams. So it was a product of an outrage resulting from Washington's denial of a visitor's visa for his former police chief. And that really reflects the nature of foreign policy making in Manila in the past 4 years. The Philippines' South China Sea policy has been largely determined by his very narrow parochial concerns. And Duterte has no coherent, well thought out strategy on dealing with China and South China Sea. What is constraining him from completely embracing all of China's policy preferences are the pushbacks from for some key figures in his own government who are more interested in defending their country's national interest rather than simply pandering to his concerns as their boss. And the reversal of his decision to terminate the VFA was an indication of that as well. There was really no rethinking. So these are the dynamics at play that are resulting in Manila's confusing South China Sea position. And I don't think that Duterte is going to change tack anytime soon, unless something extraordinary happens, like maybe an artificial island building in the Scarborough Shoal or outright ejection of Filipino troops from features that the Philippines currently occupies.
Yeah. Thank you. I have the same opinion with you, and I think that is important for any administration in each country to put the interest, national interest, for the sovereignty of the country first, rather than any political motivation.
All right,
Yeah.
thank you. We're down to our last two questions. This one is from Gita Lestari, Universitas Indonesia. I would like to express thank you for the committee to help for this event with amazing speakers explaining the SCS. Also, finally, I can see Mr. Carlisle Thayer presenting. Thank you for your FPDA's writing. Sir, it helps my master thesis. Warm regards from Dr. Eddie Prasetio from UI. Well, I would like to ask the role of ASEAN in the dynamic of the SCS from the panelists' perspective, if possible. What can we do as a regional regime in response of the SCS dispute, especially with recent development? Thank you for the success of the committee. Anybody from our speakers?
Yeah.
Let's have Honorable Justice.
ASEAN works under the principle of consensus, but we will never have a consensus in ASEAN on the South China Sea dispute beyond the statement that the dispute should be resolved in accordance with international law and in particular UNCLOS. Because you have two countries there, you have Cambodia and Laos, who will always block any strong statement against China. So I think what we should do is for the 5 countries affected by the 9-dash line, the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and Indonesia, to come together to coordinate their efforts. Like, for example, we can enter into a convention that none of the islands in the Sprat list generate an EEZ. That's very easy. Everybody agrees with that. And therefore, that principle will govern freedom of navigation on our flight. And we will open that convention to the naval powers of the world. And that will, in effect, enforce by state practice the ruling. And we can also conduct joint patrols among ourselves, because to patrol your own EEZ is your right. That's a lawful, that's a peaceful exercise of a right. So we can jointly patrol each other's exclusive economic zones, and nobody can stop us. So I think we can do this, escalate this, and we can also join the other naval powers when they exercise their FONOPS, freedom of navigation operation, because these operations are a very strong enforcement of the arbitral ruling, because they say these operations are based on the principle that there are exclusive economic zones around the high seas of the South China Sea. And if there are, then that rebuts China's 9-dash line. So there are many ways that we can do, but there has to be political will among the governments of the 5 ASEAN states. We cannot expect ASEAN to do this. We must have a coalition of the willing. And the coalition will be the 5 states that are prejudiced by the 9-dash line. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice. All right, our last question coming from the attendees. From Ruben Gamala. With the strategic direction of China's expansion of power globally, isn't this a wake-up call for states, both not affected and affected actions of China, to come up with a joint position before China's display of power reach their shores to send a strong and clear message to China? If this issue is not taken seriously by these states, this issue will continue to linger unresolved.
I can try to answer that because I track what we do with India, and I used to be a European specialist. There is value in that. One of the reasons India has gotten closer to the United States and has strengthened its partnership with Vietnam is because of China's incursions and violations of border territories and delineations or agreed upon positions with India, both in the Hindu Kush and between Bhutan and Nepal. The key challenge is, however, these countries don't want to be tied to any particular multilateral treaty or commitment outside of the UN or the ones they've already joined. One of the things that I think has happened as a result of China's aggression against India is in the 1990s, China assured the Stand countries, Kyrgyzstan and one of the other Central Asian countries, that it was no longer interested in pursuing its territorial claims inside their country. Most people don't realize that China traditionally claims about 1/3 of Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan. They dropped that in the 1990s, but they had also dropped their claims against Bhutan. So now they're resurrecting and indeed expanding the claims against Bhutan. That has to have raised alarm bells in Central Asia. And so when we talk about education, collectively and individually, we need to engage those countries and say, here's what they're doing today, you might be tomorrow. Because China has a history, particularly under Xi Jinping, of assuring people no military adventures, we're not going to militarize, we're not going to expand, and then they do. Historically, we saw that in Europe in the 30s. It's now being resurrected in Asia. So I'm hoping that the US administration will unite with its partners in Asia to get a collective position against resurgent territorial claims that go beyond what has been agreed upon in the past or accepted in the past. But until we get the other countries to sign on, and I'm not talking about Southeast Asia or the ASEAN countries, you're looking at Central Asian countries as well as India. Once they are awakened to the threat, then China will face a broader range of resistance, and that may deter further aggression. Hopefully that process has started, but at the moment, it's in its early stages.
All right, Captain, thank you so much. That was our last question. Thank you, gentlemen, for your participation. Dr. Zhao, thank you so much for helping moderate this open forum. All right, we have gotten a good look at the subtleties of the subject. We have a couple of commentators to kind of give a retrospection or parting words, conclusion, perhaps. The first one is Attorney Viet Huang, a law lecturer at the Ho Chi Minh City University of Law and expert on international law and law of the sea from Vietnam. Hello, Attorney Viet. Do you have Attorney Viet Huang?
Yeah.
There you go. Hi, sir.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am. In our conference, we have a lot of scholars and experts from some countries to talk about the South China Sea dispute. So I think that we are seeing now the next step in the South China Sea situation now. We a lot of many countries send a letter or diplomatic note to the UN to present point of view about the South China Sea dispute. There are some common things among countries that is many countries include the Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, the US and Australia. All of them protest the net line, the so-called net line of China. So we can see next step, and we can hope that in the future we can. I agree with Dr. Dr. Hu from Malaysia that some Asian countries, claimant states in Asian, can agree with them about something, so that we can find a peace solution for the such a dispute. So I think that we can hope in the near future we can have a good COC code of conduct for the South China Sea. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Attorney Viet Huong from Vietnam. I'd like to call on our next commentator, Mr. Ashish Shah, an environmentalist and founder and director of Wild Ecologues in Delhi, India. Mr. Ashish Shah. Mr. Ashish in the house still?
I think Mr. Ashish Shah has dropped from the call.
All right, okay.
We'll continue with the next. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Beth. All right, at this point, thank you once again for your participation, guys. At this point, we'd like to do a little recognition of the Philippine team of the arbitration case against China's 9 dashed line claims in the West Philippine Sea or the South China Sea at the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, Netherlands. And this will be led by former Congressman Felicito Payumo. Is the former Congressman around? Wala rin yata si former Congressman Payumo.
Wasn't able to log in, but Dr. Jeffrey raised his hand. Sir, do you have something?
Oh, sorry. No,
Oh, okay. All right.
that was a mistake.
Well, we can go ahead with the recognition without Mr. Payumo.
All
But
right.
let's call on, if she's still there, Miss Vicky. Oh, she's not there anymore. Okay. So I will just flash the screen on the Philippine team. There. Go
All right,
on, Ms.
Ms.
Diane,
Photo.
with the script.
Go ahead, Ms. Beth. And photo is the Philippine team of the arbitration case.
Okay, I would like to read a recognition from the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea. Let me just share this part. In recognition of triumphant representation in the UN Tribunal Permanent Court of Arbitration, the National Youth Movement Governing Board presents this resolution in honor of the members of the Philippine team. Former Philippine President Benigno S. Aquino III, former Department of Foreign Affairs Secretary Albert Del Rosario, former Solicitor General Florin Hilbay, Philippine Supreme Court retired Senior Associate Justice Antonio T. Carpio, former Justice Secretary and current Philippine Senator Laila de Lima, former Presidential Advisor on Political Affairs Ronald Llamas, former Speaker Sonny Belmonte Jr., former Executive Secretary Paquito Ochoa Jr., former Defense Secretary Voltaire Gazmin, former Philippine Supreme Court Associate Justice Francis Hardeleza, former Chief Presidential Legal Counsel Benjamin Caguiwa, former Deputy Executive Secretary Minardo Guevara, who is also the current Secretary of Philippine Department of Justice, Honorable Consul General Henry Bensurto Jr., former Muntinlupa Representative Rodolfo Biazon, Chairman of the Committee on National Defense and Security of the House of Representatives, former Security Cluster Executive Director Emmanuel Bautista, Attorney Abigail Valte, Director of UP Institute of Maritime Affairs and Law of the Sea, Dr. J. Batong Bacal, and legal counsels led by Paul Reichler of Foley Huat. Whereas the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea exists to protect the sovereignty of the Philippines and advances to preserve its rights over the West Philippine Sea, whereas the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea appreciates and recognizes groups and individuals who are one with its mission in protecting the country's sovereignty and in working to preserve and safeguard the territorial rights over the West Philippine Sea, former Philippine President Benigno S. Aquino, and all the delegates and participants we mentioned earlier, through their able presentation and representation of the case, the United Nations Arbitral Tribunal in The Hague has decided on July 12, 2016 that the Philippines has exclusive sovereign rights over the West Philippine Sea and that China's 9-dash line is invalid. Now therefore be it resolved that the members of the board of the National Youth Movement for the West Philippine Sea express its sincerest appreciation and recognizes the contribution of the members of the Philippine delegation to the United Nations Arbitral Tribunal in The Hague. And be it further resolved that the statement of recognition be appropriately inscribed and conveyed to the persons we mentioned, with a copy to be included in the official minutes of the July 28, 2020 meeting of the board. Signed on this 28th day of July, 2020 by Dr. Celia B. Lamkin, Global Chairperson and Founder of the National Movement for the West Philippine Sea.
There we have it. Thank you so much, Ms. Betuin Austria, as well, for taking care of the technical side of our conference today. And maybe we can give a round of applause to the whole team, a virtual round of applause. There you go. Aside from Ms. Betuin, we have and would like to thank a lot of people for making this happen. From the invitations and promotions, from a press release and correspondence, we have, of course, Dr. Celia Lamkin, the founder and global chairperson of National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea, Attorney Viet Huang for press relations and correspondence, Mr. Ken Calyawood, National Youth Movement West Philippine Sea press relations officer, and a representative from Florida, USA. For the logistics, thank you so much, Professor Pablo and Ms. Betuin Austria. For our registration, we also had help from our friends, Professor Pablo Espanola, who is the global media head of National Youth Movement for West Philippine Sea. Thank you so much, Reverend Monsignor Jerry Bitoon, Engineer Reniel Rocaberte, Mr. Henry Tachado, Attorney Amy Alado, Engineer Cherito del Carmen, Ms. Eleanor Balyaran, Ms. Malu Hermida, Ms. Norm Silvestre, Ms. Vicky Estelia, Honorable Payumo, but unfortunately wasn't able to make it. Thank you so much for helping us introduce our resource speakers for today. We'd also like to thank Mark Payuran from our Rizal chapter for helping us screen the questions for our speakers. We have to thank our friends from the media as well, Mr. Ken Calyawood, Mr. Morris Philip, Attorney Viet Huang, of course, our Vietnam country chairperson. Thank you to our sponsor, Mr. Ronald P. Lampkin and Dr. Celia Lampkin. Thank you so much to our resource speakers, Captain Carl Schuster, Dr. Carlisle Thayer, Mr. Bill Hayton, Dr. Jeffrey Ordaniel, Dr. Din Huang Thang, Dr. Ari Afriansha, and Dr. Hu Chiu Ping. To our moderators, thank you so much. Dr. Zhao and Huang, and our commentators, Attorney Viet Huang and Mr. Ashish. Thank you. Of course, to our guest speaker, Honorable Justice Antonio T. Carpio. Thank you to all of you for staying with us all afternoon, rainy afternoon in Manila. Thank you to our guests, Honorable Consul General Henry Bensurto Jr., Consul General, Philippine Consulate, San Francisco, USA, and Honorable former Ambassador Bayani Mangidin, and Sir Pramod Sharma of India, Founding Director of Youth for Peace. Thanks to our friends in the media, Mr. Bryant Macalle, Executive Producer of ABS-CBN News Channel, or ANC, Francis Folve, ABS-CBN reporter, Ms. Frances Mangosing, reporter from Philippine Daily Inquirer, Mr. Ger Cahiles from CNN Philippines, Zaldi Dandan, Mariana's Variety Editor, Saipan, USA, and Ms. Tess Cosipag, publisher of Balita, Canada. And of course, to everyone of you who supported, who watched, who participated, who collaborated with us and helped make this very first virtual international conference on South China Sea possible. Thank you so much to all of you. In closing, I guess I would say the fight for our sovereign rights over the South China Sea is far from over and shall continue. So we can only keep asserting, keep educating ourselves, using our voices, and praying that all will be well in due time. All right, thank you so much to everybody. This is the ending of our virtual international conference on South China Sea. Thank you so much and enjoy the rest of your day. This has been Diana Dial. God bless you all.